Lannister. Chapter 71. Letters. Cersei Lannister Pav. First, the Dornish princess had bullied poor Callum, belittling and insulting the soft boy. Then Jaime was sent off to marry a Tyrell girl from the Reach, and now even Rhaegar, who Cersei was supposed to marry, was stolen away by some snake from Essos. It made her want to cry, but she would not because she was too strong, so instead she prowled up onto the deck and watched the land pass by because it was all she could do. She stalked back and forth, like an angry yellow housecat as she glared at the alien landscape of the Dornish coast. She had read about it before, a huge flat desert land of dried out mud flats, sand, and death, and it certainly looked like it from where she stood on the deck of the ship. A thin skirt of palm trees gave a band of green near the edge of the water, but so thin that you could stare right past them into a hellish yellow and orange expanse. Sand, sand, sand as far as her eyes could see, stinging in the reflected light of the midday sun. The view was only occasionally broken by great stones rising from the ground, barren monoliths of banded rock that were dappled with color and potential interest but helpless against the sheer scale of the desert about them. Was this the land Callum was to be stolen away to? This wasteland that stretched into the distant horizon. It made her stomach turn as her vivid imaginations conjured images of her poor brother withering away to dust on the sandblasted heights. She knew that part of her wasn't rational, that House Martell controlled fertile lands and green gardens amidst those sandy dunes, but she couldn't help but think of it anyway. What was she supposed to think about instead? There was nobody to talk to. The afternoon blazed on down, such that Cersei's skin began to redden even as her mind continued to run in circles unbidden, until in the distance she saw the land break away to the west, and the water changed color as if a gigantic painter had drawn up a brush the size of the Seven Kingdoms and painted the water green instead of blue-gray. The heat felt even more oppressive, choking now, and sweat poured from her forehead and soaked into her clothes. Sir Oswald, could you go ask the captain if we've just entered the summer sea? She asked. Of course, Lady Cersei. The knight nodded, before leaving her sweltering alone on the deck. The bosun, she couldn't remember his name, she'd never talked to the man more than a few words, bellowed orders, and the ship began to turn, men rushing to adjust the sails. They were most of the way done by the time Sir Oswald came back. He says we are on the summer sea now, Lady Cersei, and that in around an hour, we should be able to see Sunspear, though we've no plans to stop before Aldtown. Sunspear, Cersei mumbled. She wondered if Princess Enella would be there right now. Perhaps she should drop in on House Martell, and see what they were really scheming about. She was just about to ask that they visit when she caught herself. No, she shouldn't. She had already had her opportunities for adventures stripped away from her like a gown on a betting night. She didn't want to know what would be taken if she caused more problems. She needed to get back to the rock where things made sense. Cersei sighed. Standing up from her chair, she went right back to her cabin. Do you feel unwell, my lady? Sir Oswald followed after her, tromping along. I have no desire to see Sunspear. Dorne seems unpleasant enough as it is. Cersei said bitterly and shut the door behind her. Going to her desk, she again pulled out what little paper and ink she had, and this time, she began to write. To my most beloved brother Jaime. I hope that the Reach finds you well and that you are having many fine adventures squiring for Lord Luther in Highgarden. She paused for a moment, considering her feelings. I have found that I missed you dearly and that King's Landing has been increasingly unpleasant recently, so I asked Father to send me home when he could. I shall be in Aldtown when I send this letter, but I will return to the Rock afterward. I am sorry to be so near to you and yet unable to see you, Jaime. It makes my heart ache in my breast. Cersei tapped her chin gently. She didn't want to ask about the Tyrell girls, or really about that Mace boy Jaime got along with, but she didn't have much else to say. Know that I am thinking of you and keeping you close in my heart, dearest brother. Cersei smiled as she signed her name. Writing the letter hadn't taken as long as she'd hoped, but it did feel good to release her feelings through ink and pen. Unfortunately, she had to keep it short for Jaime. Jaime didn't like to read. She pulled out another sheet of paper. She only had 5, but she knew who she wanted to write to next, obviously. To my most, Callum couldn't be her most beloved brother too. That was Jaime, obviously. To my most beautiful and precious brother Callum, she wrote out. Knowing him, he'd probably get flustered when he read it. That made Cersei happy. I hope that this letter finds you well. I have missed you dearly since that. Cersei considered her language for a moment, then decided she really didn't care. Dornish harlot bullied you and stole you away to Sunspear. I hope your stay there wasn't too terrible despite the arduous sun and miserable deserts of Dorne. She snickered to herself. I am writing this letter as I pass by that blasted wasteland myself, returning to the rock from King's Landing. Soon we will be able to see each other again in person. Cersei felt a grin spread over her face. That would be the good part of this entire trip. Of all the people in the world, only Jaime and Callum could ever possibly understand her. Father tried, and Aunt Jenna was close, but only those two knew her well enough. Jaime because he was born with her, snuggled in the same womb, and Callum because he shared her misalignment of heart and body. It would be good to be with him again. She had so much to tell both of her brothers. I have so much to tell you about when I return to the rock, Callum. Did you know there are tunnels in the walls all throughout the Red Keep? I found the entrance to one of them in my bedroom by accident, a wooden panel just wedged open a bit. When I explored it I found that they went everywhere, all over the castle, and there were peepholes in all the rooms and chambers so that I could watch all the comings and goings everywhere. Cersei smiled as she wrote. I wish I could have shown Jaime and you and taken you down there with me on an adventure because I had many of my own. Cersei reminisced as she wrote, her pen slipping across the page as she conjured memories in her mind. There was a large chamber with a mural of dragons on the walls, and paths down to the Targaryens' treasury vaults, glimmering with gold, though nowhere near as much in all of them as in even one of the deep vaults in the rock. I spied on bedrooms and common halls, offices, and training yards, and not one of the fools realized I was there. That I was spying upon them, little Cersei hidden away where they couldn't see her, but I could see them. She giggled as she continued to write. You wouldn't believe how many affairs I saw between the courtiers. Those women at court will spread their legs for anyone. Lord Celtigar was sleeping with no less than 3 other men's wives that I saw, and from the looks and sounds of it, he must have been better than their husbands because, Cersei's pen screeched to a halt as she recalled that she was writing this to Callum, not just to get her thoughts down on paper. She felt her cheeks flush ruby red and drew a line through the middle of her last sentence. Please ignore that last line, Callum, my thoughts got away from me and it's improper to write such a thing to someone blessed by the maiden with a pure heart as you are. Cersei frowned as she tried to think of something else to write about. Ah, right, she should ask about Callum too, not just talk about herself. That would be impolite. I will be sending this letter from Aldtown when I reach it. We heard that the Most Holy at the Starry Sept proclaimed you were blessed by the maiden, Smith, and Crone when you were in the city. I think I may visit him myself when we make port there. I wonder if I may be blessed by the warrior or the father if you are blessed by the maiden and the crone. Perhaps our blessings were merely assigned to the wrong child by accident. Cersei smiled, knowing Callum would understand what she meant. At any rate, Callum, I have so many things to speak to you about when I return to Castle Rock. I hope to see you soon. With most heartfelt love. Cersei Lannister. Cersei grinned as she finished the second letter. It felt like a weight had been lifted off of her shoulders. She still didn't feel like going above deck to see Sunspear, but the boredom no longer felt as pressing. She glanced at the few remaining sheets of paper she had smiled, and began to write. Lannister. Chapter 72. Roses and Hedgerows. A.N. Next goal for another extra chapter is 100 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Jaime Lannister Pav. Jaime quite liked Highgarden, the truth be told. It was a splendid castle, with 3 towering white curtain walls and more than 50 towers. It dominated the shore of the Mander from its position on a tall hill above the river. The outer wall served as a border between the fields of yellow roses, carefully cultivated over thousands of years by small folk, that stretched away in all directions towards fruitful orchards and idyllic farms. Currently, Jaime could see none of that though, as he was inside the outer wall, enjoying one of the castle's more famous features. Or trying to at least. Jaime pressed his back up against the hedgerow, quieting his breathing as he held his wooden shield and padded sword to his breast. Tip-tap, 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 2 pairs of footsteps marched along the opposite side of the hedge. One of them sounded heavier than the other, probably Mortimer, Esser Tarley's squire. Jaime heard them pass the opening beside him, not stopping for more than a moment to look, and then he fell upon them. His wooden sword struck Mortimer in the back and sent the boy tumbling into his smaller companion, now revealed to be Piter, Esser Larry's squire. Jaime grinned as he walked forward and batted the younger boy about his shoulders too. That was foul, Lannister. Piter groaned. What sort of knight attacks a man from behind? One who's fighting in the hallways of a castle, Jaime replied playfully. Or why do you think these bouts are in the hedge maze? So that the Tyrells feel like they're getting some use out of their gardening, Piter grumbled, but he got up nonetheless, glancing up to where Sir Ronel Tyrell, Mace's granduncle and the arms master of Highgarden, was watching the game. Back to the table for us, I suppose, Hyder grumbled. And back into the hedges for me. Jaime grinned, ducking back into the leafy hallways to hide away from sight once again. Jaime rather adored this game the Highgarden squires all played. The hedgerow of the castle, which sat within its outer wall, was cut in such a way that all angles of it, if one was not pressed directly against a hedge, could be seen from atop the middle wall of the castle, which was near 100 foot high from base to top, unlike the outer wall at 50. This meant that the defenders of the castle could rain murder down on any invaders trying to navigate or hack their way through the hedgerows, but it also made it a wonderful place for the more practical sort of training. The Knights of the Reach had a reputation in some lands of being flowery tourney knights, rather than true warriors, and while Jaime could well attest that they wore a lot of flowers, to think they were incompetent simply because they were foppish was a mistake. They loved their games and jousts and feasting, but all were set to the purpose of battle. Jousts and melees taught men well enough to fight, and regular feasts saw the sons of the Reach grow tall and strong, albeit sometimes a mite heavier around the waist. This hedge-maze fight was no exception, for these winding paths and leafy corridors in practice resembled the halls and chambers of a castle or the alleys of a city street, and Jaime had heard tell that such fighting was the bloodiest and most gruesome form of warfare. The game was a melee played out in the hedge maze, and it could last for hours or whole afternoons if no reason was found to stop it. Two teams of squires were assigned a table and a clearing that was to be their home castle, perhaps a quarter-mile down the walls from the other team. Like a tourney melee, each boy Jaime defeated earned him a point, but unlike a tourney melee, the boys could return to their home castle and after a period of 5 minutes measured by an hourglass had passed, they could return to the fight. Sir Ronel or one of the other knights made sure that it was all in fair play, and while some of the boys did come out of it quite battered and bruised, most all of them enjoyed it. It was much better than yet another spar in the courtyard, or worse a day spent maintaining their master's armor. That was one menial task that Lord Luther mercifully spared Jaime due to his status. Returning his focus to the game at hand, Jaime paused as he heard the tromp of clanking boots, 1 or 2 rows over. He grinned, only one of the squires in Highgarden yet had plate armor. Even Jaime made do with a chainmail shirt for the moment, though his father had arranged that the Tyrells would have a proper suit made for him if he entered any tourneys. Jaime shouted loud enough to carry over the hedges. Is that you over there, Mace? The Tyrell heir was on the opposite team from Jaime today, and that meant that both of them would be coming to dinner bruised, possibly bleeding. I can hear your clunky suit of plates from a mile away. Jaime. A good afternoon to you too. Give me a moment. There's a clearing where we ought to meet a bit ahead if you fancy some sores on your ass. I fancy putting some knocks on your head. Jaime replied over the hedgerows even as he made haste towards the clearing, having spotted it now as well. He grinned as he saw the older boy step out ahead of him. Mace was tall at 16 years old, technically a manground now, but still a squire for the moment. He was in no rush, he had explained. Being a squire was hardly a great inconvenience and he was planning to win the tourney at Hornhill in a few months to earn a proper knighting with trumpets and such. Jaime was rather hoping to take that knighthood for himself, but even if he won he probably wouldn't get it. In truth, Jaime had learned, it was very rare to see a squire knighted before the age of 13, not unless he'd seen a real battle. Jaime thought it unfair, but that wasn't to say that Mace Tyrell didn't deserve to be a knight. With more than a foot of height over Jaime, and nearly as long a reach, Mace struck first, his padded sword whipping around in a slice at Jaime's shoulder, and Jaime was forced to duck back, because he had fought with Mace many times now, and knew that the older boy, now legally a man, had fine control with the edge of his blade. The sideways cut could have struck up or down or turned into a thrust seamlessly in the hand of the Tyrell heir, just as Jaime himself could manage. That meant that it was worthless to engage Mace on his own tempo. If it came to it he could just drag Jaime into a brawl and beat him to the ground, as had often been the result of their sparring. No, Jaime only won when he managed to get off good, solid hits against Mace, which has become infinitely harder since he started wearing platemail. That made it almost completely unfair. Almost, but not quite. What's wrong, Jaime? Gotten tired of sporting a bloody lip? Figuring out how to give you a bloodier one. Not the best quip, but passable. Jaime thought he could have managed better banter if he wasn't constantly backpedaling out of the range of the armored boy's strikes. It really was quite unfair. Anything less than a blow that could knock Mace over would be barely noticeable to the boy. With that in mind, Jaime dodged another couple of swings. His plan was formed now, he just needed to execute it. All done up in his armor, Mace was still good, but he had a tendency to get overconfident, and he couldn't see as well. Jaime used that to his advantage, as with the next swing, rather than letting Mace recover, he rammed his shield as hard as he could into the tip of the other boy's sword, giving Jaime enough time to step around to the left of it before Mace had full control. With a smooth motion, Jaime pushed his sword towards Mace's face in a thrust, causing the older boy to raise his shield and block it, completely cutting off his line of sight, which was exactly what Jaime wanted. Since Mace had started the exchange by stepping forward into his swing, his right foot was extended forward from his left in the ground, and Jaime brought his own momentum around to crash into the older boy's back, taking advantage of his extended footing to send Mace stumbling forward into the hedge. With a laugh of triumph, Jaime ran up behind him and shoved him further into the hedge, kicking at his backside with his foot. Og, aagh, damn it, Jaime, the first give. Mace yelled as he thrashed about, now half stuck in the branches and thoroughly discombobulated. Casually, Jaime delivered one last kick to his armored behind, then helped drag the larger boy out of the hedgerow, tugging him out by his armor. The thoroughly embarrassed Mace Tyrell that emerged from the bush had a branch poking out of his helmet still covered in leaves, and he grunted as he pulled the bassinet off of his head. Damn it, Jaime, did you have to do that? He complained without an ounce of heat. I was having fun there for a bit. I did. Jaime replied cheerfully. In fact, I believe that was the cleanest win I've ever gotten on you, not a scratch on me. Only scratch on me is on my aching pride. Mace grumbled, how did you move there? I didn't see you get behind me. I just stepped through the whole motion. When you blocked my thrust, I was already halfway around, Jaime said cheerfully. I knew you wouldn't be able to see. Jaime tapped his head. Jaime, you're a frightening lad, Mace commented as he finished brushing the leaves out of his hair. Not as good as me without cheating like that, but still. Cheating. It was your footwork that did you in. Jaime protested, but Mace only laughed. Everything's cheating if it's making me lose. He clapped Jaime on the back. Say we head up to the castle for dinner already. Have some lunch, we can go visit little Willa's. Jaime smirked as he heard the cheerfulness in Mace's voice. The older boy was already a father, married to Lady Ellery Hightower, who had already been pregnant during the king's tourney when Jaime had met Mace. Apparently, the Tyrells wasted no time in forming alliances with their bannermen, though he supposed that Callum's betrothal to Elia had been no less premature. Yes, I'd like that, I think. He's so much less whiny than his father. Hey. For his part, Jaime rather liked little Willis Tyrell. The cute babe had fat cheeks and a tranquil, almost contemplative look. It reminded him of Tyrion as a baby, only not nearly as ugly. As for Lady Ellery, he had no hard feelings for the woman. Unlike some of the other women of Highgarden, Jaime did not much like Mace's family. Lord Luther was fine, cheerful, did all the things a lord ought to do, and did so with a smile. He spent a good amount of time teaching Jaime in the yard and had a relaxed sort of aura that had shocked Jaime at first. It was so different from the cold steel eyes and flint claws of Jaime's own father. Lord Luther heaped praises upon Mace and Jaime both at every opportunity, where Jaime could only remember a few occasions that father gave him so much as an approving nod. No, Lord Luther and Mace were fine, but Lady Olenna and her daughters. Janna was the most tolerable, and she was still egregiously boring. She didn't know a thing about knights or horses or adventure, and while Jaime had no issue with embroidery, fancy dresses, or flowers, the fact that they seemed to be all the girl was interested in baffled him. She seemed to be insulted when he so much as suggested that she could perhaps join them on a hunt sometime. The girl liked hawking as a hobby, but that was about the most exciting thing she did, and Jaime didn't have the patience to stand still in a field while a bird did all the work. Janna was thus relegated to boring at best. Mina, and especially Lady Olenna, were worse than boring. They were mean. They sniped at every little thing Mace, and to a lesser extent Jaime did, like a pair of chattering songbirds. They would go on for hours during dinner practicing their insults, subtle and unsubtle, at the boy's expense. Lady Olenna would even make fun of Lord Luther in his own castle. Being around them was like being ground down by sandpaper or a whetstone, constant irritation at all hours of the day. A lady should be beautiful, fair, and charming, and while Minutes was pretty and Lady Olenna was probably beautiful when she was younger, the poison tongues of the mother and daughter put him off of them completely. Jaime hoped that if he must have a wife, that she would be more like Cersei. Someone fiery enough to match his pace, beautiful as the striking sunlight, and skilled enough to match him in all things, be it the yard or elsewhere. Jamie felt his cheeks flush a bit at that thought, but shook it off after a moment, following Mace up out of the hedge maze and leaving the other boys to continue the fight behind them with the best combatants gone. They were halfway past the Blue Tower when the runner found him with a letter from his sister which had just arrived at the rookery, one that made Jamie smile. Cersei was going home. That meant that she, Callum, and Tyrion would all be in the same place for the first time in ages. Perhaps he ought to ask Lord Luther to take a trip to Castle Rock soon, so he could see his siblings once again. Lannister. Chapter 73. A Night in the Green Study. Next goal for another extra chapter is 100 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Qyburn Pav. So. Callum Lannister stood across from him in the boys' study. The windows were open on the upper level of the green wooden room as the arc lamp crackled above, hidden away by a mirror hung below it to spread its light about the study, and then cloaked from the outside world by thick curtains that the boy had raised around his lonely tower. What progress have you made? Qyburn frowned slightly. The boy had proven to be a good master, but that did not mean he let Qyburn act without scrutiny. No, while Callum Lannister gave him money, resources, access, and protection to far more than he ever had with the brave companions, the Wayfish child also kept a tight leash about his neck. He had made it clear early in their relationship that he knew precisely why Qyburn had been thrown out of the Citadel, and he kept a keen eye on Qyburn's work in turn. The first volume is nearly done. That was not to say Callum did not wish to make use of his talents, or that he didn't appreciate him. No, frighteningly, the child had a purpose even for Qyburn's more disreputable interests. I am just finishing the preface. I expect it to take but 1 or 2 more days. Excellent. Callum smiled. Though his eyes were still sharp, his tongue did still manage those compliments Qyburn so desperately longed to hear. I've said it before, but you're one of the greatest living healers in the world. I'm excited to read the project myself if I can find time, the boy grumbled the last part, shaking his head. Qyburn couldn't help but preen at the acknowledgement. For so long in Essos he had gone without it. He'd spent 1,000 lonely nights studying the secrets of life and death, wondering if anyone would ever recognize just how far he had come. It was not of incredible difficulty. In truth, most of it a maester learns in his first few years as an acolyte. Regardless of the difficulty, it's good you've been able to finish it so quickly. The boy glanced over at Esser Ilyn, his silent henchman across the room. The knight was silent of course, his tongue severed long ago now by the blade of King Aerys, another man as wronged as Qyburn was, though by a different master. Still, Qyburn knew the knight was sharper than most men for his silence. Of all the Smith child's minions, Qyburn thought that only Esser Ilyn knew Callum Lannister's mind better than Qyburn himself. With this, I'll have something to turn the presses to when we finish printing next month. Qyburn felt his eyebrows crawl up his forehead. So, soon. He had heard that the printing was to take 3 years in total, to make 1 million copies of the 7-pointed star. By his math, the boy had started only 2 years ago. I had thought it would take 6 more months at least. Our concept of time was off. We didn't plan that the men actually doing the printing would grow better and better at their tasks. Callum said, smiling. There's always potential for issues. We've been burning through the ink too fast, Ilyn tells me, but if the next order of ink gets done on time then the 1,000th book will be finished in 26 days. Callum smiled. I've not been tracking it as closely since the statue business started, but Ilyn, mercifully, has had his merchant's sons doing the maths. Esser Ilyn let out a rasping, wheezing chuckle at that. For the 2nd year, I believe that 1,800 copies of the 7-pointed star has been the product of an average day. I see, Qyburn replied, swallowing. I suppose you'll want to move to producing the standards of healing soon then. Callum grinned and nodded. 30 presses will go to the church, but the rest I'm keeping for House Lannister. I think we'll make, probably 20,000 copies of your book in the first run. Right now, I can choose how to set demand because I have the only supply. Esser Ilyn wiggled his hand back and forth noncommittally but Qyburn could only really boggle at that number. He still hadn't grown used to the idea of the press. Books were something that took months to make at the fastest, a creation of artisanal precision and long hours spent writing beside a candle. The idea that they could speak of making them in their thousands by the day. The thing still hadn't quite settled in his head. It was preposterous on the face of it, world-changing but that was everything with Callum Lannister, wasn't it? There was an arrogance to the boy, an arrogance and a madness. Qyburn knew what to look for. Nearly all maesters went mad eventually, and as a student of necromancy, the man could hardly claim full sanity. Callum Lannister though had a madness of a different sort, one that threw all good sense and reason to the side on a whim. Like a legend from the Age of Heroes, Callum bottled lightning to make a candle apparently entirely without sorcery and built a machine that could do the work of 10,000 septons every day without fail. Qyburn had his private doubts about the seven-faced god. He had peered past the doors to death many times and never found the stranger. But whatever his feelings on the faith, he knew for certain that there was something supernatural about this boy, something more than human guiding him. It was inconceivable that there was not. If I may ask, Qyburn paused, what will you do with the rest of the presses? Surely you won't need all of them too. Callum. Qyburn blinked as a young woman's voice echoed up through the tower. I know you're up there, the servants told me. The former maester watched as that domineering, arrogant child seemed to physically recoil, his hackles raising and his slender shoulders curling inward. Cersei, he whispered, the boy's face suddenly growing a little pale. Back so soon? No, I suppose it's been long enough. He looked around, a bit panicked. If you won't come down, I'll come up. Callum blanched but quickly turned to Esser Ilyn. Esser Ilyn, please bar the hatch. He hadn't even finished giving the order when the hatch flipped open and a grinning blonde head popped out, smiling brilliantly. Hello. Qyburn glanced at her, then back to Callum. The girl must have been between 10 and 14 years old, with brilliant blonde hair and a figure that was clearly already starting to fill in, though she was somewhat gangly. She wore a red velvet dress that bore some obvious smudges from her hasty climb up, but, contrary to most noble girls Qyburn had encountered, she seemed to barely care at all as she bounded over and dragged her younger brother, Qyburn's eccentric master, into a hug. Callum, it's been so long. I think you've gotten shorter. Cersei Lannister said cheerfully as she squeezed her younger brother in her arms. For his part, Callum looked to be distinctly uncomfortable. Actually, he was getting pale enough that Qyburn thought he might be at risk of fainting. She moved to hold him a bit away from her and looked the boy up and down. Well, you've gotten prettier too, so that's all right, she giggled. Gee, good to see you too, Cersei. Can you let me go now? Callum asked, clearly tugging away from her, which unfortunately prompted her to pull him into a hug. Now, typically, seeing the dismay this action caused Callum, Qyburn would think that the older girl was intentionally putting her brother into an uncomfortable situation to get a rise out of him. However, Cersei Lannister's body language actually screamed of sincerity. She was clearly just an affectionate sibling who missed her brother, which made Qyburn wonder why Callum was reacting so badly to it. He glanced over at Esser Ilyn, who shrugged and began to scribble on his notepad. What do you mean? Why aren't you hugging back? Have you come to hate me while I've been gone, Callum? Your poor sister. Cersei asked, now adding a bit of actual sarcasm to her tone, which Qyburn could hear quite evidently. Or were you not expecting me? Did my letter not arrive? No, I got your letter, Cersei. I'm just, shocked to see you home so soon. Callum's words sounded forced, just like the motion as he wrapped his arms around his sister. While the mummers show was going on, Qyburn just read the note Esser Ilyn had passed him. Callum's afraid of his sister, doesn't know what to do with her, doesn't like being around her. Qyburn snorted, glancing over at the girl who had only now finally released her younger brother, talking to him excitedly about what she'd seen in Aldtown and the adventures she'd been on in King's Landing. All dreadfully boring by Qyburn's standards, and quite typical for a girl her age. He glanced back over at Esser Ilyn, asking with his eyes if the man was serious. Callum Lannister was afraid of her. The boy who seemed to want to single-handedly reshape the world was afraid of a typical 12-year-old noble girl. Esser Ilyn just shrugged at the implicit accusation. Qyburn snorted and turned back to the ongoing explanation of some tunnels in the Red Keep. Fascinating, he was sure, for a child, but not particularly important to Qyburn. He hoped that this girl and the strange effect she seemed to have on her brother wouldn't seriously impair Callum's ability to direct the goings-on of his various projects. Qyburn was actually quite interested to see the statue business completed after all. Apologies, Lady Cersei, Master Callum, but I think I will take my leave for tonight. Qyburn cut in when the girl finally stopped to breathe. I will let you know, of course, when the book you requested is complete. He nodded to Callum and headed for the stairs, uncaring of the squeal of excitement that followed his departure, accompanied by fervent questions of what exact sort of book the boy had commissioned. Qyburn could still hear her from the bottom of the rookery in the tower, idly feeding a bit of bread from his robe to one of the ravens as he headed out into the cool night air. Perhaps what Callum was afraid of was the damage to his ears. Lannister. Chapter 74. Callum the Blessed Eye. AN. Next goal for another extra chapter is 300 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Cersei Lannister POV. The air was hot and thick with the smell of salty sea spray as Cersei Lannister sat on the platform beside her Aunt Jenna. The wooden structure was high enough to look over the crowds, though not so tall as to block the view of the 20-foot bronze statue behind them. It was the spitting image of her mother Joanna, holding a spear with a torch at its point, her hair flowing down her shoulders and a long flowing dress hiding her legs away from sight. The polished skin shone in the light of the morning sun as a great multitude of people, tens of thousands surely, milled around the great red granite platform that stretched from the foot of the Gold Star Sept all the way down to the sea. She had never seen so many people in one place before. Thousands and thousands and thousands of them. The great square was more than a mile long and at least a quarter-mile wide, but it was teeming with people from one end to the other. The mass of small folk was only broken up by the two huge tents that had been erected to cover some 80,000 copies of the seven-pointed star, which were going to be handed out to the heads of household for every family in Lannisport. Outwardly, Cersei sat prim and proper in her chair, looking out over the teeming people below like a lioness on her perch, or at least she hoped that was the impression she was giving off. Inwardly, her stomach was bubbling with a mixture of excitement and anxiousness. She wasn't stupid, she knew this was a big event. Nothing quite like it had ever happened before, Aunt Jenna had told her, and it was all because of her little brother. Cautiously, Cersei glanced up the stands to where Callum stood next to Uncle Kevin, on the highest section of them. He looked serene, angelic as he waved his hand gently at the passing small folk, who seemed to utterly adore him. When they had come from the rock earlier in the day, the wheelhouse had nearly been stopped as the small folk gathered on the street sides tried to get in and ask Callum for blessings. At least that was how it had felt to Cersei. Fortunately, Uncle Kevin had armsmen escorting them and they were able to clear a path, albeit slowly, through the streets of Lannisport. Even now those same armsmen formed a ring around the stands, though there was significant tugging and pulling in the crowd around them as small folk tried to get a better look, or shouted in the hopes that Callum would hear them. Part of Cersei felt jealous of all the attention her girlish brother was receiving, but another part of her pitied him. While Callum was a beautiful boy, blessed by the maiden and charming in Cersei's opinion, she knew him well enough to know that the serene face he was showing now was an act. Callum never looked like that normally. He was quiet sure, and much calmer than any of the other boys in Castle Rock, and sometimes when he did get excited he was all smiles and pride and grand gestures with his arms, like when he showed her the light ball thing, or when the ugly dwarf showed him his bad poetry. But Callum never looked like he did today. No, that tranquility was a mask, she could tell. From just a few feet away she could see his hand shaking slightly, and the hand Uncle Kevin kept on his back. No, Callum wasn't enjoying this. She remembered vaguely something he'd said years ago, a conversation she'd half overheard with Jaime. Callum was scared of the faith, scared to be up there, but he was putting on that tranquil expression and waving politely. That made Cersei feel proud, much more than his bookmaking presses, or the light ball that stung her vision from how bright it was. Callum was brave enough to stand up there even though he was scared. It made her proud of him, but it also soured her on the crowd of devotees hassling to get a good look at him. Couldn't they see they were scaring him? She glared down at them imperiously, only to feel a smack on her hand. She looked up at Aunt Jenna, her hand slightly stinging. Auntie what? What have I told you about feeling jealous about your brother Cersei? Auntie Jenna spoke quietly as she looked down at her thaw not too far down, she was a short woman. I wasn't. Cersei whined quietly, holding her hand, though really it hadn't been hit very hard. Really? You've spent the past 3 minutes looking at your brother, and then you immediately started glaring out at the crowd, Jenna said, leaning forward. Don't think you can lie to me, girl. Your father might have no idea what you're thinking, but I know a young woman's mind well enough. It wasn't, they're making him scared, can't you see? Cersei whispered back to her aunt, not wanting Callum or Uncle Kevin to hear. They should leave him alone. Aunt Jenna snorted. I doubt you'd be any more comfortable than your brother if you were up there being ogled at by half the city, but Callum's a smart boy and it was his decision to go out and give practically every man in Lannisport a holy book. She reached out and rested her hand gently on Cersei's shoulder. Your brother's name is being praised by every Septon in the Westerlands. He's going to have to get used to it eventually because this will probably follow him his whole life. But, Cersei started to protest, half jealousy of her brother and half care. It was unfair for Callum to be praised so much when he didn't want it at all, and for Cersei to not be praised at all when she wanted it. No buts, besides Cersei, Callum's not half as afraid of the crowds as he is of you. Aunt Jenna said, chuckling slightly and turning Cersei to face back towards the crowd. Now look proper, your uncle is about to start the speech. Cersei blinked, and, with lessons that had been drilled into her despite her protests and lack of interest, straightened her back as she looked up at Uncle Kevin, standing up on the highest part of the platform with a big smile on his face as he looked over the crowd. People of the Westerlands, today is a joyful day. Uncle Kevin shouted out over the crowd, though she was sure that most of them were too far back to hear him. Even if everyone was quiet, there was still a wave that ran through the small folk, as they all turned to look up at the castellan atop the wooden stand, with Callum next to him. Today, by divine inspiration and miracle, House Lannister and the Gold Star Sept have worked together to provide every family in Lannisport with a copy of the seven-pointed star. We give this gift for the souls of you and your children, that every believer might enter the seven heavens and be washed clean of their failures by a better understanding of the seven. The people cheered, as was entirely appropriate since House Lannister was giving them something so valuable. Cersei smiled at the cheering. Her uncle's speech was very good. After the crowd had calmed down a bit, Kevin spoke once again. It's a shame that my brother, your Lord Tywin, could not be here to present this gift to you all in person, he said, frowning slightly, before smiling again. But I do have a letter here from him that he instructed me to read. Shall I read it out for you all? The cheering was loud but somewhat quieter than before as Uncle Kevin held up the letter and began to read. To all my loyal and honest subjects, the fair people of Lannisport and the Westerlands, know that House Lannister has prepared this gift as a balm for your souls. I urge you to learn to read the seven-pointed star yourselves, or with the help of your septons, and to grow in faith and understanding of this tome. This, I believe, is the greatest of gifts that House Lannister can offer you, and I provide it to you free of charge, in the hopes of ruling a better, more pious kingdom in the years to come. Kevin paused to take a breath as the crowd kept quiet, waiting for more. In truth though, while I did fund this endeavor, I must credit my son, Callum Lannister, whom the faith has proclaimed was blessed by the smith, warrior, and father, with the gift and foresight to create these scriptures. Let it be known that he is the ultimate source of the presses that made this great generosity possible, and I will not take credit for my son's work, only his funding. Kevin chuckled at that, his dry reading of the letter sending a wave of laughter through the crowd. Lannister. Chapter 75. Callum the Blessed 2. A.N. Next goal for another extra chapter is 400 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Cersei Lannister Pav. In truth though, while I did fund this endeavor, I must credit my son, Callum Lannister, whom the faith has proclaimed was blessed by the smith, warrior, and father, with the gift and foresight to create these scriptures. Let it be known that he is the ultimate source of the presses that made this great generosity possible, and I will not take credit for my son's work, only his funding. Kevin chuckled at that, his dry reading of the letter sending a wave of laughter through the crowd. Cersei snorted, but for a different reason. Her father had, tellingly, left off Callum's blessings by the maiden and the crone, two that in her opinion, were likely more truthful than whatever the High Septon had been bribed to cook up. She had pestered the most devout who had declared Callum blessed when she had been in Aldtown, but he had looked at her once and then asked her to leave. It had annoyed her at the time, but in hindsight, it probably meant he was all the more serious about Callum's blessings, not someone who could just be bribed with money to gamble away like the High Septon. Now, let it be made clear that no one should take more than one of these gifts for his household, lest he be cursed by the seven, and also a criminal and a thief before the eyes of House Lannister. Let all honest men rejoice, however, in the gifts we offer. Kevin cleared his throat. And that's the end of the letter. Now, I would say to start, but before we begin handing them out, I believe that Septa Margot of the Gold Star Sept has some words. Thank you, Lord Kevin. People of Lannisport, rejoice, for we are all blessed this day. Septa Margot was on the other side of the stands from Cersei, so she couldn't see the woman, but she could certainly hear her. Her voice was much louder than Uncle Kevin's, near at the edge of screaming and projected over the crowd. I tell you truly, this is a miracle unheard of, in all the world no other god besides the seven who are one has ever made something like this happen. No other god could inspire one young child to bring forth such a momentous gift to all the people of the Westerlands and beyond. I tell you truly, all of you, every last one, has seen a miracle of the smith this day. She shouted and there was a low murmur at that, slowly building into a great cheer as she continued to hype them. Shout praises from the rooftops, sing hymns and burn incense, speak whatever prayers you know, and throw your cares aside for the seven are with us, and they have blessed us all by blessing one child. The crowd was only building in pitch, and Cersei saw that Kevin and Callum both were starting to look a little bit concerned. Actually, Aunt Jenna did too. Is something wrong? Cersei asked her aunt as the septa continued to rile up the crowd into a religious fervor. They're growing quite rowdy. Jenna said, it could grow dangerous. And they have given you this gift. No less than the hands of the smith himself could have fashioned such a machine, and had the crone show it to a child in their dreams no less I tell you. Margot screamed and the crowd screamed in turn. See this miracle child before you all, blessed by maiden crone and smith. The septa shouted, see the child and call them a blessing, know that through him the seven have acted amongst you, have wrought a change in your lives to save your very souls. Septa Margot's voice was getting a bit ragged, but the crowd seemed to be under her spell completely. Say the child's name now, and pray for the seven to speak through him. Blessed Callum, beautiful child. Cersei had never seen her brother suck in quite as big a breath, his teeth grit as his lips pulled back, his eyes flicking back and forth as the crowd took up the chant. Blessed Callum. Callum Lannister. Blessed Lion. Beautiful child. Hand of the smith. Cersei watched as her brother raised a, noticeably quivering, hand, and a hush fell over the crowd. If anything, he paled further as they fell into silence, and she could almost watch the gears turn as he realized that now he would have to speak. From his expression, she didn't think he had one ready. Good day, fair people of Lannisport. Callum stuttered at the start but seemed to gain more composure as he continued, resolution building in his eyes. I stand before you today as a servant of the seven-faced God, presenting a gift to you, the children of the seven as a fellow child. He smiled, though Cersei could tell it was a nervous one. I bring this gift to you as something I have dreamed of doing since I was smaller than I am today. And I hope you like it. I dream that one day, every man, woman, and child in the Westerlands, my fellow children of the seven will be able to read this scripture as I can, to learn of the seven and their works. I hope that in this reading, we can all find strength in faith, absolution for our sins, and salvation for our souls. Callum stared out over the crowd as he seemed to search for his next words. I ask nothing for this gift I have brought you, save that you be loyal and true, to the seven, and to my family to House Lannister, and loyal to your neighbors also, kinder, better, and more caring. Help them when you can, and give charity when you can, that is all I can ask of any of you. He clasped his hands. Beyond that, all I have to say is that may the seven bless the Westerlands, this day and forever after. Let the distribution begin. Silence held for a moment as Callum finished speaking, sitting back down beside Uncle Kevin, but as the Castellan moved to take control of the crowd once again, they burst into further cheering, even louder than it had been before Callum spoke, and the crowd began to rush the two massive tents full of copies of the seven-pointed star. The septons and septas, who had been all prepared to hand them out, instead found themselves ahead of a massive mob of people caught up in fervor, and rather than oppose them, joined in. The tents were dragged away or ripped open and the copies of the seven-pointed star began to be handed down to the crowd as many even began to climb on top of the massive stacks of books. The people began to wash over the square like waves on the beach, moving in their multitudes as Cersei watched on. Above her, Kevin chuckled sadly, and Callum only cringed. Careful effort and planning were disrupted as the precisely planned distribution was turned into a scrum in the throes of religious fervor. Strangely, the riot of the faithful wasn't what stuck in Cersei's mind that evening as she tried to get to sleep. Instead, it was a remark that Aunt Jenna had made in passing when she had corrected her earlier. Not half as afraid of the crowds as he is of me. Cersei wondered, tightening the covers in her hands. But that's not possible, Callum isn't afraid of me, is he? Chronicle of the Targaryen dynasty in the Seven Kingdoms. Maester Willem. 278 AC 7th day of 8th moon. Princess Valia, the wife of Prince Rhaegar is found to be pregnant by the Grand Maester, a child is expected in roughly 7 moons. King Aerys Targaryen and his hand Lord Tywin Lannister provide a city charter to the town of Stony Sept in the Riverlands after determining that its petition is legitimate and that the town contains some 30,000 small folk, marking the second such charter granted during King Aerys' reign. Petitions arrive from other large towns across the Seven Kingdoms, but Lord Tywin Lannister urges caution in assessing worthy candidates. An announcement is also made of a betrothal between Robert Baratheon and Lyanna Stark. News arrives from the Westerlands that House Lannister is finally beginning to deliver copies of the seven-pointed star to their subjects, but that a riot broke out in the square of Lannisport before the gold star sept as the small folk, stirred by their faith, stormed over and took the books for themselves rather than waiting for the distribution. After some discussion, Lord Tywin announced that no action would be taken against the unruly small folk, as their actions did not seem to be driven by malice, and there was no way to tell the innocent from the guilty in the crowd at any rate. Lannister. Chapter 76. Fear in the Dark Eye. Next goal for another extra chapter is 500 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Cersei Lannister Pav. Cersei's mouth tasted sour as she walked through the dark tunnel, her nails digging into the palm of her hand. It had been 2 weeks since the book distribution, the riot of the faithful as they were calling it now, and everyone had been worrying about how to deal with the debacle. With the people just surging over the book piles that way, there had been no way to track whether every family in Lannisport had got one. Uncle Kevin, Callum, and even Aunt Jenna were focused wholly on cleaning that all up and trying to prevent future repeats of it. It was a double rush because Callum was to leave for the north coast on the morrow, to squire with Uncle Tigget far away, where he could no longer manage his presses and such. But that wasn't what was weighing on Cersei's mind. No, what filled her thoughts was a far more personal worry. Aunt Jenna had said it, and Cersei had confirmed it. Callum was afraid of her. She didn't know when it had happened, or why. She had never noticed it before, but when she went to hug Callum the night after the speech, to tell him how pretty he looked up on the stands and how he did such a good job being brave and giving such a good speech, she had noticed how uncomfortable he was in her arms, how he squirmed, and he wouldn't look her in the eyes. It stung her heart, and she cried herself to sleep that night. But Cersei stopped crying in the morning. She had a boy's heart after all. No, if Callum was scared of her, then she'd just have to be kinder to him, nicer, and even more loving older sister than she was before. And so she'd tried, all through the past 2 weeks, she'd tried, to the exclusion of nearly everything else. She'd stopped pestering Aunt Jenna about getting her a tutor so she could learn more about sword fighting, a prospect her aunt had never actually shot down completely. She'd gone to her embroidery lessons without complaint just so she could get out of them faster and go visit Callum. She'd rushed back and forth across Castle Rock trying to find him near every day and then practically planted herself at his side, asking if he needed anything, if she could help him with anything, if there was anything she could do for him. At first, it had seemed to work, at least a little bit. Callum had, in those first few hectic days after the riot of the faithful, asked her to help him with some few small things. She had helped him with some of his logs, and he had talked to her about one of the problems he was having, that small folk didn't have house names, so figuring out which of them did and didn't receive books already, even outside of the riot, was very complicated. Cersei didn't particularly care about the small folk of course, but she knew Callum did, so she had asked why he didn't just give them numbers or something since he liked numbers. Callum had actually looked over at her, no fear in his eyes, and thanked her for the idea. It had made her heart thrill. So she had rushed forward and hugged him, pressing his face to her bosom. Alas, the fear had come back after that, and Cersei again didn't know why. What was there to fear? Who could possibly be feeding him lies about her to make her fear him? Her first thought was that perhaps it was the dwarf. Their ugly twisted sibling was close to Callum, for her brother's soft heart forgave even their mother's murder, but she dismissed it after a moment. While she hated Tyrion, he was also too small, dumb, and ugly to twist Callum against her. So it must be someone else, perhaps one of her bedmaids. But no, both of them liked Jaime better, and she hadn't ever heard them talk to Callum more than a few words. So for 2 weeks now she has tried to grow closer to Callum once more. She would rush to embrace him, to compliment his every good aspect, and to encourage him that he would succeed at every pursuit he put his mind to. She tried her best, but it only got worse. He only seemed to grow more frightened of her if anything, and it stung her heart like a poisoned dagger. No matter how much she thought of it though, she could not find the source of his fear. Desperation though told her to keep trying, to find the source of the spell that had been cast over her brother. The source of the wall that had come between them. That desperation had only been building up until tonight, the evening before her brother left the castle for good. The thought of Callum leaving, still afraid of her, still scared of her presence. It was like ice water in her veins. She did not want Callum to fear her. She did not want him to need to fear anything. But all means of subtlety or intrigue had failed her. She still had no idea why he was scared, why her own little brother, her mirror in so many ways, would be frightened of her. She could not let it stand. She could not. It stopped her from sleeping, tossing and turning, and sending her bedmaids and servants away. She was unable to take her mind away from it. She had to know why. She had to fix it and make him love her again. She could be subtle no more. Perhaps she never should have been, to begin with. Subtlety was a woman's way, but Cersei had the heart of a man, so she should have been open and asked Callum directly. Yes. If she had done that first, then perhaps she would not be trapped in this infernal dance. She stood from her bed, and put on her finery once again, fixed herself properly, and steeled her heart. Tonight she would learn the truth, tonight she would fix it. And so, in the dark of the night, Cersei Lannister crept from her room through the dark. Her bedroom was far away from Callum's, on the other side of the living quarters section of the rock, but that was no trouble. Cersei knew these tunnels like the back of her hand. She had long ago memorized them in her dreams of being Lan the Clever. She did not want to be seen, so she took one of the older tunnels, confined, but hardly ever used by servants, and she strode through the dark with confidence, her eyes glinting green in the sparse, dim light available, until she found the door to Callum's chambers. Cersei paused in the hallway, took a breath to steady herself, then pushed the door open and crept inside, careful to shut it behind her. The light of the moon over the bay at Lannisport glinted through the plate glass windows, illuminating the spacious chamber. Callum's great four-poster bed sat in the middle, with a large desk covered in papers, a fat wardrobe with a trunk at its foot, and several bedside tables, candles, and more scattered about atop a fine SOC rug. Cersei had not been here since she was a child, since before the king's tourney at least, but she crept forward with confidence, drawing back the curtain of the bed to find nothing. Callum was not here. Cersei swallowed, the ice water rushing back into her veins as her heart beat like a drum in her breast. Where was he? He should be asleep at this hour. Had Callum been hurt? Kidnapped? What had happened to her brother? Frantically she began to look around the room, walking over to the papers on his desk. She could not make them out in the moonlight more than that they were drawings of some sort. Nothing to be found there, only more toys Callum was making. Her panic only grew as she looked elsewhere for a sign, anything to tell her where her brother was. She could not let it end like this. She could not let it end in failure with Callum still afraid of her. Lannister. Chapter 77. Fear in the Dark 2. AN. Next goal for another extra chapter is 700 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Cersei Lannister Pav. Nothing to be found there, only more toys Callum was making. Her panic only grew as she looked elsewhere for a sign, anything to tell her where her brother was. She could not let it end like this. She could not let it end in failure with Callum still afraid of her. She pulled back the doors of the wardrobe and rifled through the clothes, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing to suggest where her brother might be. She popped open the trunk and began to pull out its contents, possessed by a spirit of desperation and urgency. Until her hands settled on fine velvet, buried at the bottom of the chest, and an entirely different set of emotions ran through her brain as she pulled it out. This is a dress, isn't it? Cersei's desperation was smothered by surprise, holding the fine thing up. It was slender at the top, but long and flowing below, with fine fabric cut in many luxurious layers that would hang down over the legs, edged with lace, and sewn with such precision that Cersei couldn't spot a single stitch out of place. Cersei wasn't sure that even she had a dress this nice, though Aunt Jenna had one like it. It was far too small for her though. No, this wasn't even big enough to fit Cersei, but it might be able to fit. Why does Callum have this? Cersei moved her hand to cover her gaping mouth, almost reflexively as thoughts raced through her brain. This dress was sized perfectly to fit him too. It wasn't like there was some girl who he might have gotten it from. Has he worn it? She wondered, her mind racing, having shifted tracks entirely. Did Callum go around wearing a dress? Did he enjoy wearing them? He was blessed by the maiden after all, but it would be bad if anyone knew, wouldn't it? Cersei knew that King Loren the Fifth Lannister had worn his wife's dresses and gone about Lannisport in them, disguised as a whore. That's why people had called him Queen Loren. Was Callum doing that? No, he'd never do it in public, but perhaps Loren had been like him, a boy with a girl's heart. Did it run in the Lannister blood? No, wait, that wasn't the point that she needed to be thinking about right now. She needed to figure out where. The creak of the door opening behind her set the hairs on the back of Cersei's neck on end, as light filled the room, and she whirled, still clutching Callum's dress. Callum had walked into the room, dressed in a nightgown and holding a small oil lamp with a light flickering at its tip. He looked tired, his hair was wet, and as she turned the smell of rose water hit her nose, so he must have just come from the bath. He shuffled into the room a bit before noticing her. Turning to her with wide eyes. Sir Seafoot, he started to say, before he saw what she'd been doing, his eyes tracing over the piles of his clothes haphazardly strewn across the floor around his trunk, Cersei clutching his fine dress. The oil lamp dropped from his hand with a clatter and everything fell into darkness as the light sputtered out, both of them standing there not saying a thing for a long moment, as both of their minds raced to find an answer to the situation they found themselves in. Callum thought first, and turned towards the door, trying to run. Cersei saw that, and on instinct shot forward, casting the dress aside she tackled her brother to the floor before he could reach the door. She was taller, stronger, and a better grappler besides, she pinned down his arms to his sides as he panicked beneath her. Cersei, whatever you're doing you need to stop, I don't want this. I don't want this. Callum started, but Cersei just blinked, a bit confused by his words. Calm down Callum, I'm not going to hurt you. Cersei ordered, her blood thundering in her ears. She couldn't let him get away, she needed to talk to him. She needed to find out why he was scared of her. I just want to talk, just listen to me. She could see the panic in Callum's eyes there in the moonlight beneath her, his chest rising and falling like a forge bellows beneath her as she looked straight down into his eyes, his struggles slightly easing, but never stopping. T-talk. You snuck into my room, pilfered through my things. Callum said. And now you're on top of me. Well, I couldn't let you run. Cersei protested, and I didn't mean to go through your things. I just wanted to know where you went. She said they were both quite loud though their faces were only a few inches apart. I need to ask you something. Callum stared up at her, his face tightening, but still clearly terrified. It felt like knives on Cersei's heart, seeing him look at her that way. Then let me up first. He said, glancing towards the door, she saw it too. I can't do that if you're just going to run away again. Cersei said firmly, pressing him down. Promise me you won't. Fine, Callum replied. I'll hear your question, I won't promise anything except that. All right, Cersei nodded, kicking out with her foot to shut the door, making Callum wince as it slammed closed. She gradually got up off of Callum, before tugging him up to his feet with her. Callum was frowning deeply as he got to his feet, looking at her with eyes of green still on edge. He backed away from her 2 steps, but he didn't run for the door. That was good. She would have had to tackle him again if she did. He looked at her and nodded, the frown on his face deep in a way that hurt to see. Go on then Cersei, ask away. Cersei felt like she had made a mistake somewhere. He wasn't supposed to be angry and scared of her even before she asked the question. But she forced herself anyway, swallowing to clear her throat before she finally spoke. Callum, I want to know why you're afraid of me. Callum paused, then looked across the room. Cersei, you just snuck into my room and ransacked it at night, should I not be? No. Cersei protested loudly. No, I mean not tonight. I understand I was over aggressive in my search for you, but I only came tonight to ask you why. Why have you been scared before now? I would never hurt you, Callum. But you're always shying away when I hug you, or squirming or acting like I will. Cersei tried to explain herself but the words weren't quite right. I'm your big sister. So why do you act like I'll hurt you? Who lied to you and said I would? I wouldn't hurt you. I would kill to protect you even. In the darkness, Callum blinked, then shifted on his feet. You snuck in, pilfered through my things just to ask me that, Cersei? He asked, sounding more confused than anything. You could have just asked me in my study if you were wondering. Wait, Callum stared at her intensely, his eyes glinting in the dark. Cersei wasn't quite sure what to make of this new look from Callum, his gaze scrutinizing her thoroughly. I guess I could have. Cersei scratched her cheek, a bit embarrassed now. It's just, I couldn't get it off my mind tonight, you know. I couldn't get to sleep, what with you leaving tomorrow. I don't want you to be scared of me. She felt tears start to form in the corner of her eyes. I'm sorry if I made a mess of that. Callum sighed, walking over and sitting down on his bed. Cersei, no, don't cry. He stepped forward. This is my fault in part as well. I just know I should have had this conversation with you sooner, but it's a hard one. Callum said. It's not that I've ever been scared you were going to hurt me. The boy's voice cracked slightly. It's more, God, this is awkward. Callum cringed. You mean it? Cersei asked, feeling her heart pound in her chest. You're not scared of me after all? She asked eagerly, rushing over to him. Wait, no, I mean, I'm not scared of you that way, Cersei. It's just that you're a bit, well, you're very physical with me. Callum explained. I'm not comfortable with it, you know, all the mothering you do. Cersei blinked, her thoughts screeching to a halt. Huh, wasn't that what she was supposed to be doing? But I'm the eldest and with mother gone, well, that's my role, is it not? Her thoughts were racing. Was that what Callum was actually worried about? The mothering. The idea seemed absurd. Who was scared of their mother? I'd prefer if you took a different role with me. A more equal one, Cersei. You're only 2 years older. I don't need to be constantly comforted like a baby. If anyone needs that, it's poor Tyrion. Callum spoke softly. I'm not sure what that role should be, but I would much prefer if you treated me normally as your brother than trying to be my mother. Lannister. Chapter 78, Fear in the Dark 3. AN. Next goal for another extra chapter is 100 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. I'd prefer if you took a different role with me. A more equal one, Cersei. You're only 2 years older. I don't need to be constantly comforted like a baby. If anyone needs that, it's poor Tyrion. Callum spoke softly. I'm not sure what that role should be, but I would much prefer if you treated me normally as your brother than trying to be my mother. Cersei frowned, looking at the pretty boy in front of her with new eyes. He really wasn't much younger than her. It was true, perhaps she could stand to, well, treat him less like a baby, even if they were both still children. In that case, I will do my best to protect you, Callum, not as if I were your mother, but as your elder sister. She grinned, feeling her confidence return. Callum smiled at her, and it was such a beautiful, pure smile. She didn't think she could ever remember him smiling at her like that. If you mean that, Cersei, I'd appreciate it greatly, Callum said. And try not to be scared of you in turn. I never meant to hurt your feelings by it. I was just uncomfortable with you hugging me tightly practically every time we talked. Of course I mean it. Cersei said proudly, placing her hands on her hips. How could I not want to protect you when you're practically a mirror of my own circumstances? Cersei said, trying to sound heroic. Callum paused again, looking at her slightly confused. Elaborate. Cersei blinked. Had she really never explained this to him before? Well, you know, I'm the oldest of our siblings, and I'm a woman, but I have a manly heart. I'm nearly as good with a sword as Jaime. I hate embroidery and all those girly things, and I'm strong, fast, and I've a clever wit, Cersei said proudly, before leaning forward, placing a finger on Callum's chest. Meanwhile you, Callum, have a girlish heart and are blessed with the very beauty of the maiden. Like a mirror of me. Obviously, since I have a manly heart and I'm older, it's up to me to protect you and keep your pure, soft heart safe. Cersei giggled. I'm just jealous of Jaime, he's the only one of us that came out with both halves matching, you know. If Callum had looked confused before, now he looked positively dumbfounded, but that made sense. His mouth hung open slightly as he leaned back in his seat on his bed. It made sense, of course. If he'd never thought of it before, of course he'd be shocked when Cersei explained the truth of everything. Don't worry too much about it. Cersei grinned, taking his soft hand in hers. Just know that I'll always be here to protect you, Callum. Looking at her beautiful brother, she smiled. Before feeling her heart stir with passion, she leaned forward and pressed her lips into his, placing a kiss onto his open mouth. Taking the back of his head in her hands, she felt their breath mix for just a moment, hers strong and hot, his quick and breathless, before she drew back, a wide grin on her face. Cersei, did you just kiss me? Callum sounded disbelieving, baffled, but Cersei only laughed. Of course I did, now my promise is sealed with a kiss. She grinned, that way you'll remember it when you leave. Cersei smiled broadly as she turned to the door. She had done everything she came here for, now Callum wouldn't be scared of her anymore, and everything would be perfect. She would stop mothering him, and treat him as he ought to be treated instead. She could hardly keep the smile off her face as she headed back out into Castle Rock. The air tasted as sweet as Callum's breath. Cersei, that's not, bleak, Callum's voice followed her for a short while. No doubt he was shocked by her assertiveness, but that was what it meant to have a male heart, wasn't it? Her brother shouldn't be surprised when she took his first kiss, she had already taken Jaime's after all. Cersei walked back to her chambers with a smile on her face and a song in her heart. Callum wasn't scared of her anymore and everything was going to be alright. Tywin Lannister Pav. Tywin Lannister looked down at the man in front of him with a frown. The man, or more accurately boy, was likely not 16 yet, not at the age of his majority, but he was certainly motivated. Tywin couldn't deny that. Please SMY Lord. I've nothing left to return to. He pleaded. The squids took everything. There's nothing left. The despairing boy had ridden some 50 miles on a battered horse through the pouring rain after the Ironborn had looted his family's land and burned his home. It was a distressingly common story and one that made Tywin feel like a failure every time he heard it. Looking the boy in the eyes, Tywin sighed. Another mouth to feed, another man in need of training. But he couldn't turn the man away either. It was just another drop of the poisoned chalice his brother had served him with his Lord Temporship. Fine. I'll have you as a man at arms then. Go talk to Sir Callum, he'll see to your lodging, and teach you to fight. The man nodded. Thank you, Lord Lannister. You won't regret it. He smiled gratefully, before turning to rush out the door, off to find Sir Callum and join Tywin's band of horsemen. Tywin sighed and turned towards the map of the north coast he'd had hung up on the old stone wall. It mocked him. In terms of land, Tywin as Lord Temper had more of it than any other lord in the Westerlands, save for his eldest brother. The north coast was 500 miles from end to end, and save for a peninsula on the western side that was under House Banefort, it was all technically Tywin's domain. His holdings ran from the coast to the mountains roughly 20 to 50 miles inland depending on the region, and extended as far south as the valley north of Ashamark. There were 5 major rivers as well as more usable bays, inlets, and natural harbors than the rest of the Westerlands combined, as unlike the western shore, the land here ran smoothly down to the sea with no great red cliffs. That was the source of the region's problems, in Tywin's opinion. It was perfectly good land, fertile, warm enough, and with access to the plentiful fish of Ironman's Bay, but with no natural defenses and its proximity to the Ironborn, it had been a favorite raising location since the Age of Heroes. The gentle sloping rivers made it easy to sail a longboat up for access to the interior, and the many available harbors and smooth beaches made it impossible to predict where a raiding party might land. While many small houses had, over the history of the Westerlands, tried to establish themselves in the region, all had failed to deal with the Ironborn threat. Even the Ironborn themselves, ironically, had found that the region gave them no natural protections from Westerlands hosts that would attack from the mountains when they settled there. The north coast was thus a nearly lawless borderland, and one Tywin had seen fit to give Tywin charge over. What a joke. He grimaced as he looked at the map, placing another pin in it for the most recent raid. Lord Lannister. One of his horsemen, Tion, came into the hall. Your nephew's party has been spotted approaching. Ah, and there was the other thing Tywin was saddling him with. Tywin would have much preferred his elder nephew, Jaime, as a squire. That boy showed promise in all things knightly, but Callum. While he didn't dislike the boy the few times he'd spoken to him, he never seemed particularly interested in martial valor. Kevin's letters only confirmed as much. It was a rare boy who would skip out on sword lessons to go read, much less write, books. The sentiment seemed to be that Callum was neither especially talented nor particularly poor at arms. He just didn't find them interesting. Tywin had a hard enough job as it was protecting the north coast. It would have been a much better fit if young Callum went off to squire for Garyon instead. Tywin sighed as he stepped out into the courtyard of Eagle's Nest, the sounds of hammers and saws reaching his ears. The castle was pathetic, even compared to lesser keeps in the Westerlands, an old dilapidated rectangular stone keep with a broken-down wooden curtain wall set on top of a hill looking down across the delta of the Greystone River. It was no great bastion, but it was Tywin's home for the moment, one of a half-dozen bastard castles he'd occupied during his time as Lord Temper thus far. While no lord had ever successfully occupied the northern coast for long, many had tried, and the ruins of their attempts dotted the landscape. This one had been chosen due to its proximity to the Greystone, which was an easy path for raids into the inland of the region. Lannister. Chapter 79. Duty to Protect. AN. Next goal for another extra chapter is 200 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Tywin Lannister Pav. While no lord had ever successfully occupied the northern coast for long, many had tried, and the ruins of their attempts dotted the landscape. This one had been chosen due to its proximity to the Greystone, which was an easy path for raids into the inland of the region. The keep had been restored to livable conditions first, then the stables, and now the outer curtain wall was being rebuilt. Rotten old timbers were replaced with fresh lumber, tarred, and plastered over. It was something to keep the men busy during the endless waiting games between Ironborn raids. It didn't take too long for his nephew to arrive, a red and gold wheelhouse at the head of a wagon train. Tygett raised an eyebrow when he saw that the men and even a few women who were driving the wagons were not Lannister men, but rather wore the robes of septons and septas. Tygett raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, watching as his nephew clambered out of the wheelhouse, followed by a middle-aged man in a black robe. Callum looked bright and cheery, clad in a red leather jacket with a yellow lion embroidered on his right breast. "Good afternoon, Uncle Tygett," Callum greeted cheerfully. "It's good to see you again." "Callum," Tygett replied, not feeling half as jolly as his nephew. He looked the boy up and down. He looked somewhat less girlish than when he'd last seen him, but that was probably just the short hair. The boy in front of him, though a few inches taller than he was 2 years ago, was still too slender and soft, with no sign of strength in his upper body. Tygett frowned. "I see you've cut your hair." "Oh, yes. I wanted more freedom of movement." The boy glanced over to the septons and septas as he spoke, and Tygett took the opportunity to ask about them. "It seems you've brought a pilgrimage with you." Tygett smirked. "What are they here for?" "They've brought thousands of copies of the seven-pointed star." Callum replied. "They're to be distributed to the heads of households for each family on the north coast. Similar distributions are happening all across the Westerlands right now." The boy smiled. "It's the final product of years of hard work, by me and by thousands of others." Tygett narrowed his eyes. "What's what you've been doing instead of practicing your blade, is it?" As Callum's smile fell away, Tygett turned his gaze to the older man behind him. "Who's this then?" "Ah, Lord Tygett, my name is Qyburn. I am Callum's healer of sorts." The man gave a small smile. "I was brought along because Callum and Lord Kevin thought I could be of use to you. I possess a citadel education in healing. A maester That was actually not a bad idea. Tygett had no maester of his own at present. He had been relying on local wise women and farmers who knew how to treat animals to see to his men's wounds when they occurred. Having an actual educated man with his company would be valuable. "Very well, you'll do enough to earn your keep, I trust." Tygett turned to one of his far too few knights. "Sir Gerald, see to it that Qyburn here is provided with lodging and provision." He paused for a moment. "The septons and septas too, while they stay here." As the man rushed to his newly assigned duties, Tygett turned on his heel. "Callum, follow me for a moment." "Yes, uncle." Callum hurried behind him as he walked back into the keep. Tygett didn't bother looking back, instead moving to look at the map on the wall. He placed his hands behind his back, his eyes tracing the contours of the coast. "Do you know what this is, Callum?" Tygett asked, his mouth set in a thin, firm line. "It looks like a map of the north coast," Callum replied. "I suppose the pins are Ironborn raids. This is the land I am charged with protecting as Lord Temper," Tygett said firmly. "Protecting and developing as per your father's instructions. There are 50,000 small folk in the lands on this map, and it is my duty to protect them from the 20 or so Ironborn crews that have been marauding their shores, my shores. This is my highest responsibility, and it is one that requires the whole of my effort." Tygett glanced over at his nephew to make sure that he was listening. "I, frankly, do not have time to waste on squiring you. If I was not ordered to by Tywin, I would not be doing so at all. Not because I dislike you, but because other tasks demand my greater attention." Callum looked at him with a bit of a frown, seeming to think about his words. Strange, most young boys would be spitting fire at this sort of explanation, the indication they weren't good enough, but Callum just seemed to swallow it like a sour lemon. That hadn't been what Tygett intended at all. He wanted to see the fire in his nephew's eyes. "I suppose I can understand that, uncle," Callum replied. "I promise I'll avoid any foolishness or anything that would get in the way of your duties." Tygett rounded on him. He was going to need to turn the heat up a little more. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Callum. I was a squire once, I know the mischief you'll no doubt be up to." Tygett glared. "Your Uncle Kevin tells me you've skipped on practice, fallen behind other boys your age in your martial pursuits." Tygett leaned over Callum, forcing the boy to look upwards to meet his eyes. "There will be none of that here. You will sweat and bleed and wish you were dead until you have reached an acceptable level of skill on the battlefield." Callum's frown deepened as he looked up at him, and he nodded shortly, though Tygett could tell he was starting to get shaken. "Of course, uncle. I've accepted that before I came." "Have you now?" Tygett asked. "Have you really? There are 100 young men outside, all of them from the north coast, all of them riding to fight off the Ironborn. Hedge knights and the sons of yeomen, fishermen, and farmers. Every last one of them is fighting to protect their land, the same way I am. Tygett turned back to the map. Every one of them is filled with fire and honor, they want battle and blood to win their revenge against the Ironborn. You have no such fire. Tygett said. You have no such heat, not that I can see. Is that really necessary to be a knight? Callum asked, with an odd tone in his voice. To be a knight? No, all that takes is a vow. Tygett shook his head. But to be a warrior? Yes, a man must have a fire. And Tywin wouldn't send you to squire with me if he didn't want you to be a warrior. Tygett sighed, turning back to his nephew. You're already familiar with the maintenance of armor, weapons and the like, I assume. Yes. Callum nodded. Good. As my squire, you'll be responsible for keeping mine in good condition, along with whatever other tasks I order you to do. But the rest of your time will be spent in the yard. Tygett looked down at his nephew. The boy who hadn't spoken a word in anger yet, who didn't show a hint of aggression or passion for battle. A poor fit for a warrior, at least as he was. First, we've got to put some muscle on your bones. Then we'll see if you can't find that fire. Yes, uncle. Callum nodded, looking a bit grim, but still not angry, annoyingly. Tygett frowned as he turned back towards the map. Tywin always gave him the most troublesome jobs. Chronicle of the Targaryen dynasty in the Seven Kingdoms. Maester Willem. 278 AC 16th day of 10th moon. Queen Rhaella Targaryen falls sick with an unknown illness. King Aerys is distraught and begins to hold a vigil by her side, avoiding any food or drink. The king orders all the people of King's Landing to pray to the Seven for her recovery. Prince Rhaegar and Princess Valia withdraw to Dragonstone with Prince Viserys Targaryen on the king's orders, to remove themselves in case the sickness spreads. These fears are confirmed as Lord Steffon Baratheon becomes sick with a similar ailment at court. Lannister. Chapter 80. Man from the Coast. Next goal for another extra chapter is 350 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Lyman Pav. The night was dark and hot. No moonlight broke through the cloud cover, smothering the world like a thick wool blanket. The water from the recent rainstorm boiled into the air from the summer heat and made every piece of cloth on Lyman's body sticky and unpleasant. He cursed the heat as it stopped him from resting. Tossing and turning on his bed, he got not a lick of sleep. In the end, that was what saved his life. Staring at the ceiling, he had seen the glimmer of firelight and smelled the smoke. By the time he was out the door, his parents' house was already ablaze. A number of men with torches stood about it, carrying off their possessions, their chainmail glimmering in the firelight. His blood had run cold at the sight of it, and he knew at once that his parents were already dead, or worse, captured. He saw men turning his way from the raider band, and he knew that he had to run, had to escape. It was his only chance. Lyman had grabbed their only horse, Bronn, and rode him harder than he'd ever ridden him before, plow or sickle. Bronn must have felt his fear too, because they rode like demons for more than an hour, until the farm and their old life were long behind them, burned to ashes with the only home Lyman had ever known. He dragged himself into Yarrowstone in the morning and warned the villagers there. They had thanked him and told him they were heading south with their herds and valuables, going far from the river into the uplands to wait out the raid. Lyman didn't want to go with them though. Lyman was a young man, and when the ashes of his home had cooled, they still burned hot in his heart. He wanted revenge, he wanted the blood of Ironmen. Men said that Lord Lannister was on the Greywater, gathering men to rid the lands of the Ironborn, so west he had ridden, from town to town, over foothills and across the Blackwater River through a shivering rain that cut cold and sharp to the core of his body. He rode further west still until he reached the castle at Eagle's Nest, and pled his case to Lord Lannister. Lord Lannister was an imposing man, tall and thin, but thick with muscle that was clear even beneath his leather jerkin. He had long gold hair that fell past his shoulders and a well-kept goatee. A scar down the right side of his face gave him a fearsome appearance, and he towered over Lyman with a fearsome gaze as Lyman was pleased to be admitted to his ranks. In truth, Lyman had never seen a lord before that day. Only the occasional bailiff coming through to collect Lord Lannister's taxes over the past 2 years. His father had cursed and hollered, but paid in the end, because the bailiffs always brought with them sheep and cattle of good stock from further inland, and sold them at good prices when they came to collect their taxes. He imagined it was a good thing that they did, because otherwise they would have been run out with pitchforks and torches trying to collect taxes for a lord 300 miles away across the mountains. That was different now, Lord Lannister was here, and he looked like just the sort of man who would water the fields of the Gold Gap in Ironborn blood. In the end, he had accepted Lyman, and Lyman had reported to Sir Clymouth. A proper knight, not just a horseman, Sir Clymouth oversaw the training of the men to fight. For 3 hours a day Lyman practiced in the yard, then for another 6 he worked with the rest of the men to restore the castle while the knights and Lord Lannister used the yard. The horsemen practiced with spears, and swords, and with the crossbows Lord Lannister ordered up from Lannisport. Lyman wasn't very good with the sword, to be true, but he held his own well enough with a spear grasped in both hands, and he thought crossbows were easy, just point it at the target and shoot. He couldn't imagine anything more simple. Sir Clymouth said they wouldn't learn to fight on horseback until they had learned properly to fight on their feet, so fighting on his feet was all Lyman did for that first week at Eagle's Nest. It was a school of hard knocks. The older horsemen, the ones who had been with Lord Lannister for a year at least, were brutal to fight. They mocked him when he went down, but he saw they mocked all the new blood, so he didn't feel as bad. He'd be there soon enough himself, once he got a bit older and fought for Lord Lannister a while longer. On the second day there, an old septa in the castle asked him if he was the only one of his household left. He had told her truthfully that he did not know if his parents were living or dead, that they might have been killed or taken by the Ironborn. She had looked at him sadly and pushed a copy of the 7-pointed star into his hands. Then she placed her hand on his forehead and gave him a blessing. May you walk in the light of the 7-pointed star, child. May the warrior strengthen your arm, the father give you judgment, and the mother place a balm on your weary heart. He liked the blessing, but he couldn't read the book. Still, he thought that keeping it on him might make the gods favor him just a little more, so he was thankful for it. A week later he found himself sitting around at dinner with a bowl of stew on his knee and the 7-pointed star in his other hand, trying to puzzle out the words on the first page. There were a few words at the top, then some more, then a star with 7 points, which he thought was fairly obvious, and a couple of pictures on it. A stern-looking man that looked a bit like Lord Lannister, and a pretty young girl. They had more words under them that he thought were probably their names, and lions drawn beside them. He tried to figure out what those letters meant as he supped a spoonful of stew. L, that's an L I think, and an A, so it's L-A. He worked at the first 2 letters in the stern man's name. Try and tall learn your letters, Lyman. Lyman glanced up to see one of the more senior horsemen, Philip, a broad-headed man who was mostly bald despite being no more than 30. He grinned toothily down as Lyman frowned up at him. Yes. I don't suppose you have anything better to do than bother me though. Ha, too right. Philip laughed. Thought I'd come over and have my dinner by your fire today. You don't mind, do you, Lyman? I doubt you'll go away even if I do. Too right again. Philip laughed heartily as he set himself down on the log next to Lyman, pouring the stew into his broad mouth like it was wine. Lyman grimaced as bits of beef and carrots spilled down the older man's cheeks, but he didn't seem to care at all, belching as he finished his food. What do you need to read for anyway? You're bound to be a man at arms now, boy. I dunno, I'm just bored, I guess, Lyman grumbled, turning back to the book. Well then you ought to ride up the river to Melton, the whores there are pretty enough, Philip said eagerly. They love us horsemen well too, 'cause none of them want to be taken as salt wives. We're regular heroes, hey. Lyman felt a blush form on his cheeks as he tried to figure out the letters again. Alayani, he sounded in his mouth. No, what kind of word sounded like that? He must be doing something wrong. He barely noticed Philip scoot up beside him and look over his shoulder. You just looking at the pictures. That's not reading, you know. No. Lyman snapped. I'm trying to read the names under them. Oh well, that's easy. Philip reached around with a big thick hand. That's the old Lord Lannister, and that's, I dunno, his daughter maybe. Philip scratched his chin. It doesn't quite look like Lord Lannister, Lyman commented. Was that the word? Lannister. How did those letters make that sound? Oh, no, not our Lord Lannister, his older brother. Lord Rains of Castamere himself. Philip chuckled. You're probably too young to remember that war, but my pa went and fought in it. In the army of Lord Tywin, he sacked Tarbeck Hall and helped him drown the Rhines in Castamere. That's Lord Tywin right there, no doubt. Philip pointed again at the stern man. Our Lord Tigget here is his third brother. Fourth. I can't remember. Lord Tywin rules the whole Westerlands, and he's the hand of the king too, the greatest lord of the 7 kingdoms they say. Lyman grumbled. Then why isn't he out here fighting the Ironborn? He glared down at the picture of the stern man. He sent his brother, didn't he? A great lord probably has a lot of work to do. Philip said. They say he's giving every man in the Westerlands a copy of the seven-pointed star. The Septons gave me one too before they left. Philip said. Doubt I'll ever read it, but you won't see me turn down a gift, especially one worth as much as a book. I might be able to sell it and buy another horse. Lyman sighed. He couldn't really wrap his head around all the levels of knights and lords and such, though he liked his Lord Lannister in this castle well enough. He would walk the camp and speak to his knights, and sometimes once the day's work was done but before the summer sunset, Lord Lannister would spar with Sir Clymeth or one of the other knights in the yard. Not once had Lyman seen him lose. It was frightening how fast the scarred lord was. Turning his gaze back to his book, Lyman frowned. It makes sense, Lord. Tywin's face is on the book if he's the one giving it out, but what about the girl? Lyman asked Philip. How come he put his daughter on it? No clue, I don't know how a lord thinks. Philip shrugged. She might just be his favorite child. I couldn't tell you. You're useless then. I just need to figure out how to read this and then it'll be obvious, Lyman grumbled, rolling his eyes. He stopped to take another bite of soup as he glanced over at the yard, looking over the tops of the tents where the horsemen were sleeping for now. He could see Lord Lannister out there, sparring with a young boy, probably a squire, in a red gambeson. As he watched, the slender boy went into attack with a sword but got casually kicked to the ground by Lord Lannister. As the squire stood up, Lyman got a pretty good look at his face, and he felt himself blink, once, twice, 3 times, before he glanced down at the open book next to him. Then back up at the squire, who was talking to Lord Lannister again, before raising his sword once more. Lyman looked back to the book again. Something on your mind, Lyman? Beyond your letters, I mean. No, just something odd. Lyman frowned. He looked down at the picture on the page in front of him, then back up at the squire, who was doing only marginally better than the attempt before as Lord Lannister toyed with him. Really odd. Lannister. Chapter 81. River Raid An. Next goal for another extra chapter is 500 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Tygett Lannister Pav. The bell rang in the courtyard as Callum helped Tygett put on his armor, tying his cuirass on his sides in a hurry. His nephew was, at the very least, quite deft with his hands. It was probably the one thing that he wasn't behind in for a squire his age. As the last leather strap was tied, Tygett shifted his weight, feeling the plate settle over his gambeson comfortably while Callum went to go get more of his armor from the bench. I'm surprised you aren't asking to come with me, Tygett said, looking over at the boy. Not eager to have your first taste of battle. Callum shook his head. You told me I wasn't ready yesterday, and I doubt that that's changed. Tygett snorted. That may be, but you ought to be chomping at the bit to see battle at your age. Foolish as it might be. Tygett grinned. Why, I was only 2 months older than you when I killed my first man, down in the stepstones. He could still remember it now, the sensation of plunging his dagger into the man's guts, the warm blood rushing down his arm as the wretch's intestines flooded out. One of those pirates in Maley's little navy. He died like a pig. Tygett chuckled as his nephew started to fix on his rear braces. You always remember your first, you know. Well, soon enough you'll know. I'll have you killing Ironborn by the end of the year. Tygett was pleasantly surprised with his nephew, now that he's gotten a few weeks to know him. He didn't have a fire in his gut yet and lacked the drive to be a proper warrior, that was true, but in every other regard, he was almost the ideal squire. He did his chores with minimal complaint, didn't laze about in bed, and despite Kevin's earlier letters, didn't skip out on his training. If anything, Kevin had never met a boy more willing to run laps around the outside of the motte. His armsmanship was not spectacular for a boy his Agonath the way Jaime's was, but he wasn't so far behind that it was irreparable, and unlike most children, he listened to instruction. Do you think you won't be able to stop the raiding this year? Callum asked, tugging Tygett back from his thoughts as the boy tied on his pauldrons. Tygett shook his head. Have you ever met an Ironborn Clymtalk to one that is? No, I haven't. Have you, Uncle Tygett? Yes, their lord, Quellen, was down in the stepstones with us. I've spoken to several of them. He shifted to allow his nephew better access to the straps. They told me that from the minute the first Ironborn carved the first boat he went off raiding. Tygett shrugged, making his half-deed armor clatter. I don't know if that's true, but they've been much the same since men began to write down histories. The only part they leave out is that House Lannister has been watering our beaches with their blood for just as long. Tygett chuckled. All that to say, I doubt they'll ever truly stop, Even if I butcher every sea bandit and raper that lands on the coast personally, they'll just go raid the riverlands or the north. There's no end to it. Callum was silent after that but soon came back with his vambraces, looking pensive. There must be some way to end the problem. House Lannister has tried to put an end to that threat 100 times throughout our history, but like the sea scum they are, the Ironborn always crawl back up onto the beach and raid again. Tywin held out his arm so that Callum could lock the braver on. Hells, Lord Quellan has even banned the very raiding they're doing now, but it doesn't do a bit of good. Like the mountain tribes in the Vale, or the Dothraki in Essos, some men are just born with the hearts of dogs. Tywin pulled on his gauntlet over his vambrace and flexed his fingers. And like dogs, they're only worthwhile if they're broken to purpose. Otherwise, it's best just to put them down. Callum grimaced at that, even as he brought over Tywin's gorget. I like dogs, he grumbled. I don't think I like Ironborn very much though. Tywin smirked. Maybe I am being unfair to dogs. With his armor on, he took up his helmet from the bench. Not that it matters. He glanced back towards Callum. Sir Plymouth is in charge while I am gone. It should not be more than 3 or 4 days to chase them down. Don't cause him any mischief. Yes, uncle. Good. Tywin walked out into the courtyard towards his waiting horse, Callum trailing along behind him to watch him leave. He cleared his throat, clanging his gauntlet on his breastplate. Men, Tywin shouted over the din, drawing all attention to himself. Last night an Ironborn ship was spotted by moonlight sailing up to the western Greywater Delta. I think we all know that if they were traders or fishermen they would have stopped on the coast. He looked around, holding his helmet under his arm. We ride now to trap them on the river and deal with these wretches before they can launch the raid they're planning. These bastards have accrued a debt of blood, and I intend to see it paid in full. He looked out over his horsemen. They were the more experienced part of his forces. Supposedly it hadn't been that big of a longship, and he didn't intend to throw green boys into battle unless he had to. We ride to the river, then north the ford for bloody revenge and peace for our lands. He raised his fist high, and the men cheered as they ought to. Tywin climbed upon his destrier Dernella's back. She was a large mare, of fine breeding from Westerlands and Reacher stock, and she let him see easily above the heads of his horsemen on their roundseas. Now follow me men, and we'll root these savages yet. With cries of glory to be won and thundering hooves, they left that small castle on the hill behind, and they rode for the ford near Melton, just a few miles from where the Greywater split up into its vast swampy delta. The air was thick and humid, and Tywin felt sweat drip from his forehead as he rode, but that didn't slow his pace. The horses would water and cool off in the river itself when they reached the ford, and he had a tactic in mind to see these Ironborn good and dead. It was a 2-hour ride to reach the fords, past Melton which was mercifully still intact. The sleepy market town was the closest settlement to Eagle's Nest, and Tywin couldn't even protect it, then he'd truly be a failure as a lord, or a lord temper rather. They beat a trail into the soggy ground as they finally reached the fords of the Greywater, and he called a halt as the horses took time to water. Tywin could smell smoke in the air. Lord Tywin, Sir Ludo Crakehal approached as they let the horses have their fill. I've spoken to a trader, he said. The Ironborn are already raiding upstream of here, near north of Hemon on the heights. Did he say how many? Tywin asked, to which the man shook his head. No my lord, though if they're raiding farms and not villages. It's likely a smaller band, yes. There were 2 sorts of raids that struck the north coast. Larger, more organized affairs typically centered around 1 or 2 proper Ironborn warships, and smaller, much more common affairs where the fishermen off the bay came down in an opportunistic raid like this one. Their hulls weren't so good for river sailing, but they were still flat-bottomed and the Ironborn were skilled sailors if nothing else. They would come up the rivers, loot a few farms, then sail off as if nothing had happened. It was frustrating, but they at least weren't much of a threat to the few towns and villages that scrabbled out an existence on the north coast. Still, that would make actually dealing with them easier. All right, time to set our trap then, Tywin smirked. He had a mind to force this petty raiding band to battle. Sir Ludo, have the men start hauling down large rocks, fallen trees, anything with a good amount of weight to it into the river. My lord. Sir Ludo paused. Ah, I see, how would you like them arranged? Tywin liked Ludo. The man was a bit flighty at times, but he had a decent head on his shoulders. First get a line all the way across, about halfway down the ford, broken often enough to let the water through, then more lines behind that, alternating the placement. Tygett had spent 2 years out here on the coast and caught only 3 raids in that time, but sitting in a keep stewing on how best to protect his lands gave him plenty of time to think of tactics to fight the Ironborn. We'll dredge it all out once the Ironborn are dead. Yes, my lord, Ludo nodded. Though the men will be disappointed we aren't trying to stop the raids. Let them be, they'll be happy enough with squid blood on their swords soon enough. Tygett nodded. Give the order. Aye, my lord. Lannister. Chapter 82. River Raid 2. AN. Next goal for another extra chapter is 600 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Tygett Lannister Pav. Yes, my lord, Ludo nodded. Though the men will be disappointed we aren't trying to stop the raids. Let them be, they'll be happy enough with squid blood on their swords soon enough. Tygett nodded. Give the order. Aye, my lord. And so the men set to work, dragging stones off the hillsides or logs from the patchy groves near the swampy riverside. The flat-bottomed fords were turned into a morass of swirling water as the artificial rapids churned the river. The water turned and twisted between the stones and logs. Most would probably be washed away eventually if simply left there, but the Ironborn would leave long before then, fleeing from the response that instead now waited in ambush on their escape route. It was just before dusk, with the white clouds cast in pink light by the setting sun, that the small longship came loping back down the river. Its white hull sat low with stolen livestock and whatever lucre the farmers possessed, not to mention the farmers themselves. With his fair eye, he could see them on the deck from the thicket where his horsemen lay in hiding. Men and women, children even, tied up against the rear edge of the raiding vessel. In the twilight, the Ironborn never saw the rapids that had sprung up in the river since they traversed it last night. Not until their ship's prow struck into a large stone with a crack that Tygett could hear from the shore, and the ship lurched sideways with the force of the river churning through the clutter beneath the water. That was when Tygett sounded his warhorn and like carrion birds on a beached whale, his horsemen poured from thickets on both sides of the river. They charged across the upstream part of the ford, which hadn't been changed, and in the shallow water, they found a fat ship full of terrified Ironborn and began to hew it apart. The fighting was quick and brutal. These Ironborn had helmets and shields, but only a couple had proper chainmail armor. Their thickened cloths and hides were fine for terrorizing farmers with cooking knives, but they couldn't stop a lance or a sword. One man, the captain perhaps, tried to rally the rest. He grabbed hold of the serpent figurehead at the front of the ship and began to bellow orders. Seeing him, Tygett spurred Dernella on, kicking into her sides as he rode her hard in a charge, planting his lance into the man's stomach. His chainmail twisted and broke as the force of the charge hit home, and Tygett ran straight through his guts and out the other side, knocking him off of the longship and into the wash below. The fighting was done soon after that, and Tygett's men took no prisoners and showed no mercy to the Ironborn scum. 23 men had come to raid the Westerlands and 23 corpses stained the Greywater red that evening. Within the hour the damaged longboat had been hauled to the shore, and the Westerlanders set free. He offered the would-have-been thralls and salt wives to stay with his men at camp for one night and be returned to their farms on the morrow. After that, they'd spent another day dredging the fort and returning it to navigable condition. Westerlanders used it too after all. The best prize was the longboat. Small as it was still a better ship than the fishing vessels that his own villages made. It was the first one he had captured, mostly intact. The last 3 raids he'd stopped by burning the longboats on the shore while the raiders were inland, but this was a complete victory. Tygett rather enjoyed the feeling. Lyman Pav. There weren't too many men left at Eagle's Nest once Lord Lannister rode off to go kill the bloody Ironborn, and not a one of them that was left were happy about it. No man signed up for Lord Lannister's host to be told they were too green, too unskilled with spear and sword and crossbow and horse to ride into battle and kill the raiding bastards that killed or enslaved their families. They joined to ride out and cut the still living flesh from the Ironborn's bellies and watch their guts spill out on the fine Westerlands grass, to cut their balls off and hang them from weirwood trees like the first men of old. But the Lord's orders were the Lord's orders, and he wanted only the experienced men to ride with him, save Esser Plymouth, who was left in charge of the castle. The men left behind felt craven for being left behind and stewed in their anger. There were more injuries in the training yard than usual as they beat each other blue and bloody, and had to be hauled off to the Black Maester who had forced everyone out of the building next to the stables, taken it, and made it a house of healing. It had a stone floor, which was washed 3 times a day by the men who had annoyed their betters the most, and thick wooden walls with open shutters, through which you could hear at times the shouts of the wounded men as he applied their treatment. The Black Maester was growing a strange reputation at the fort. None could deny that the wounds he treated healed faster than most, but his ways were queer and his manner dark, as if he hardly cared for the men he treated. It was a far cry from the village women who had made herbal remedies for Lyman as a child. Lyman was under his tender care today for a dislocated shoulder, having managed to twist himself in a terrible way while batting with wooden rods against one of the other men. He could see why people disliked the Black Maester, for he had set Lyman's shoulder forcefully, without a drop of milk of poppy, and had ordered him to not participate in training or hard labor for 2 days to let it recover. Having given that order, he had stalked off like a vulture to some notes or books he had against one wall. In total, he had perhaps looked at Lyman for half a minute, wrenched his arm back into place, very painfully, and then walked off as if nothing had happened. Lyman's shoulder still ached, though it felt like it was in the right place now, so he stumbled outside and collapsed down onto the wooden bench in front of the building, holding his aching shoulder and groaning as he leaned against the wall. "Excuse me." Lyman blinked. Looking around, he had to crane his head down slightly to see a boy with soft but instantly recognizable features looking up at him. It was Lord Lannister's son. Or maybe daughter dressed up as a son. He'd heard of that happening in stories, but probably a son. He looked like a son right now. Is Qyburn in at the moment? Qyburn. Oh, the Black Maester. Yes, he's inside. Lyman answered, tilting his head back. He just got done setting my arm then went right back to his books. That does sound like Qyburn, thank you. What's your name? The probably boy tilted his head, leaning his cheek on his fist. Lyman Esser, the future horseman replied, then paused a moment. If you don't mind me asking, I've got a question for you as well, Esser. The little noble nodded. I'm not a Esser yet, Lyman, but feel free to ask. I've got time at the moment since Uncle Tiggett's run off to kill the Ironborn, and Esser Plymouth hardly has time to put me through my paces. Lyman chuckled awkwardly. The question had actually been burning a hole in his thoughts for the past few days. He reached down into his satchel and pulled out the 7-pointed star. Wincing as his shoulder stung, he set it down on his left elbow and opened the first page, pointing out the pictures on the front. I've been meaning to ask you about this, my lord, but is this a picture of you on the front page of the star? Lyman honestly didn't know what to make of it. Ye see, I noticed your face looks just like it, my lord, but that's a girl, and you're a squire. The boy's face tightened a bit, his lips in a forced-looking smile. That is a picture of me, but I'm not and have never been a girl. I simply inherited my mother's features quite strongly. The boy leaned over, putting his finger on the page. It says right here, Callum Lannister, second son of Lord Tywin Lannister, whose vision and drive provided these books to the children of the Seven. Lannister. Chapter 83. Recruitment Pitch. AN. Next goal for another extra chapter is 700 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. ... Lyman Pav. The boy's face tightened a bit, his lips in a forced-looking smile. That is a picture of me, but I'm not and have never been a girl. I simply inherited my mother's features quite strongly. The boy leaned over, putting his finger on the page. It says right here, Callum Lannister, second son of Lord Tywin Lannister, whose vision and drive provided these books to the children of the Seven. ... Lyman frowned, so the lordling's name was Callum. Pardon me, my lord, it's only that I'm learning my letters and I can't read so well yet. I did not mean to insult you. It's not an insult if you don't mean insult by it, Callum replied, matching Lyman's gaze with intense emerald eyes. You say you're trying to learn to read. That's good, good for you, and good for your soul. Callum's tone softened. God smiles upon a mind eager to learn. Is there any particular area you're having trouble with? Well. Lyman scratched his cheek with his free hand. I'm having trouble with the letters and the sounds they make. This wasn't the direction he'd been expecting this conversation to go in at all. He'd been worried in fact that he insulted the Lannister lordling and that in a few years, he'd find himself flayed for it or something. Lords, he'd heard, could be like that at times. Then again, the boy in front of him looked like the type that wouldn't hurt a fly, even if he knew that the boy was also a squire training to kill, just like Lyman was. Phonics then, that makes sense. The boy said a word, probably a noble's term, that Lyman had never heard before. Like how in the word cat the letter C makes a kh sound, the letter A makes an sound, and the letter T makes a sound. I should start a handbook about that. Callum frowned before shaking his head. At any rate, Lyman, I've got an offer for you, if you'll hear it. An offer, my lord. Aye, it'll do you well also. Callum nodded. I'll teach you your letters, I've done it before, and unlike my last student, you can actually talk, so it should be quicker than it was for him. The blonde child spoke with such confidence that Lyman actually believed the claim, despite the boy not possibly being older than 11 or 12. In exchange, you'll work for me. When I tell you to get something done, you'll get to it. Of course, you'll still be riding in my uncle's horse, but you'll answer to me personally. Lyman scratched the back of his neck in thought. It sounds like a good offer, my lord, but it feels a bit odd swearing to someone your age. My age is precisely why I'm looking for hands here. I've got more than enough back at Castle Rock, but I find myself severely understaffed here at Eagle's Nest. Qyburn's my only man in these walls, and he's unsuited for just about anything that requires an ordinary person. Callum frowned. Tell you what, work for me for, let's say 3 years, and on top of teaching you your letters, I'll pull some strings when I'm older to have you made a knight. You're already training as a horseman, aren't you? It shouldn't be too hard. Lyman's thoughts ground to a stop. A knight. He could be a knight. He'd never even seen a knight before he came to Eagle's Nest, but the ones he had seen, Sir Plymouth and the rest, even Lord Lannister himself, they all rode around on massive horses wearing armor of polished steel that gleamed in the sunlight. He had seen them knock over other strong men with a single blow, and of course, he'd heard the stories as a child, about Duncan Egg, and about all the other great and heroic knights of legend. Could you do that? You're only a squire yourself, Lyman mumbled in disbelief, not a rejection though. He simply hadn't even dreamed of becoming a knight. I'm a squire, but I've got knights that work for me even today. Sir Ilan at Castle Rock, and a few others who work for him, and thus for me. If you agree, I'll see to it that one of them squires you, and you end up knighted sooner than later. Callum replied calmly. I'm not going to pretend I'm some valiant pauper who pulled himself up to knighthood by his own 2 hands. I'm the son of the most powerful lord in the 7 kingdoms, so even if Uncle Tyget works me half to death, or thinks I'm not good enough, in the end, it doesn't matter. I'll still end up a knight if my father thinks I should. Callum offered a hand up from the bench. If you help me now while I need it, I'll put my thumb on the scales for you in a few years and see you helped in turn. Lyman swallowed that information, then reached out and clasped the boy's hand. I suppose I'd be a fool to turn you down, my lord, and mother didn't raise a fool. If you promise to do as you've just said, I'll be your man for 3 years at least, I swear it. Good man, I'll make sure you don't regret it. Callum smiled. Your first task, follow me in while I talk to Qyburn. You're from the north coast, yes? Yes, my lord. Lyman nodded quickly, standing with his back straighter to hopefully impress the little lordling. I'm from the Gold Gap, due north of Yarrowston. Good, then you'll be able to provide local context on my plans. Callum smiled, heading ahead of him into the lair of the Black Maester. Lyman followed him inside quickly. Plans, my lord. Aye, plans. Callum gestured at a roll of paper that was held under his left arm. Lyman hadn't noticed it before. Qyburn, I'd like your advice on some things. Come away from your notes for a moment. The Black Maester certainly hadn't had such a friendly tone before, as he looked up from his books with an actual smile on his face. Young Callum, and, I see you've found another dog's body. Missing Sir Ilan or we? Did you just call me a? Lyman felt his hackles rise as the Black Maester called him a dog, but Callum cut in before he could shout at the man. Qyburn, don't insult Lyman please, and certainly don't insult Ilan. Callum frowned. Besides, you're one of my minions too, you know. Just a different sort. I meant it in all due respect. The Black Maester actually seemed a bit chastised, much to Lyman's surprise. What do you want advice on? I've got some plans. Longer term, you understand that I want to review with you. Lyman will provide some feedback on how feasible it will be at a local level. Callum rolled out the sheet of paper, which contained a fairly intricate drawing of a house. The drawing had it made of stone, with thick walls and thin windows. The lower floor was a sort of barn, while all the living space was on the upper floor. Lyman scratched his cheek as he looked at it. A house? Qyburn asked, looking at the picture. I suppose it's a house to deal with raiding. Callum nodded. Let me talk you through it. Lannister. Chapter 84, Vendetta on the Coast. Gorman Bloodtooth Pav. A man stared out at the churning waves, the bitter sea breeze filling his nostrils with the smell of salt as it whipped through his graying black hair, curling his beard and freezing his ears. His brow was furrowed with darkling thoughts as his armor sat heavily on his shoulders. Above, the sky slipped its cork like a billion-gallon keg and drained out a thick black downpour, splattering the stone with frigid water. It soaked through his clothes, thick wool, fur, and leather, and splashed off his bronze buckles and gold torque, making them slick and cold to the touch. In this dark place, Gorman Bloodtooth stood unmoving, a grim statue on the shore. The beaches of Saltcliffe were sullen and gray, composed of rocks about the size of a man's fist that would slide and tumble and shift to and fro with the tides. They were hard to walk on, but Gorman had always liked the challenge. He liked the sea even better. The gloomy water of Ironman's Bay was the source of life and prosperity for Gorman and his family. In his youth, it had made him a rich man, a captain in his own right plundering the shores of the disputed lands. He had gone as far east in his day as the shores of Carth and Great Merak and found there plunder, thralls, and 2 of his salt wives. It was because of the sea that Gorman, born to a fisherman of no repute, now had 3 good ships to his name, a fine stone house at the top of the cliffs, and 10 fine sons to carry on his name. It was on the sea that he had won himself the name Bloodtooth when with his teeth he had ripped out the throat of a Myrish mercenary in a bloody grapple on the deck of a merchant ship. It was on that same sea that he had won gold and jewels, silks and velvets, the treasures by which he had won the hand of his rock wife, a daughter of Lord Sunderly himself, a marriage that gave him land also, and an iron mine to lord over. Yes, the sea had been good to Gorman, and Gorman made his proper offerings to the drowned god in turn. He was not a religious man, he did not pray or wear a squid on his head, but he believed well enough that you ought to return enmity with twice its weight, and favor with thrice its weight. Since the drowned god had favored him, it was only right and just that he gave the god his due and more. These last few moons though, the sea did not seem so friendly. 5 moons ago his eldest son Rorik, his heir, had taken his smallest ship, Skolda, and set out with a band of his fellows as so many Ironborn did. 30 of them had left, equipped for fishing and for fighting. They had axes and shields, spears and bows, mail and helmet, and they had sailed out as Gorman himself had so many times before, off to adventure and plunder and loot. They had sailed for the Westerlands, he knew, and Gorman had been happy for that, because Rorik was only 17, and it would be good for him to try his hand at raiding in safer waters before he went off and ventured to Essos for plunder and glory. The north or the northern Westerlands were a good choice. There were scattered farms and small villages with few if any warriors amongst them. The riverlands he had told his son to avoid. There were few gaps in the cliffs of that towering coast, and what landings there were House Lannister kept close watch over. The Purple Eagles were perennial enemies of all Ironborn, they had been humbled once by the Hoar Kings, but that only fueled their bloodthirst. Their lands were a graveyard of young men too eager for glory. Not that Gorman hadn't dodged the headman's axe a few times in his journeys, but it was on the young to learn from the old, not the other way around. He had told Rorik more than enough stories, the boy ought to know well when to strike and when to look elsewhere. Gorman knew in his bones that he would tell his son no more stories. It was only 6 days sailing to the edge of the northern Westerlands, 11 or 12 to the other side of them. If he'd spent a few days raising them he should have been back by the 2nd moon after he left. Now it has been 5, and Gorman knew his son was dead, or rotting in some Greenlander wagon on his way to the wall. He would never see Rorik again, never hear his merry laughter. The sea had taken him, after giving Gorman so much. He knew he couldn't begrudge it one son when he had 10, but it still stung. Had he been killed on the land or on the water? Was his soul now in the drowned god's grasp? Had the storm god thrown his wrath on them when they were sailing out? Had it been on their return? Rorik's brothers all cried out for blood, from the youngest to the oldest. His sisters too, their blood ran hot with anger, but what was he to tell them? He did not know how Rorik died. Who would he take his vengeance upon? Who could he point to for his children to blame? Was it men or gods or a sudden slip on a seaslick stone that took his son from him? The rain thundered down on the stony beach but it held no answers, none that Gorman knew. Still standing out here in the damp Gorman turned, he hadn't heard the other man approaching, the crunching of rocks under his boots was drowned out by the pounding rain. He frowned as he did. Let me be Heron. Gorman sighed. This is the best way for a father to mourn his son. Alone in the rain. You don't really think that, do you? Heron asked. The man was one of Gorman's few peers on the island. He captained and owned the Leviathan's Bane, a big old Ibben's whaler that the man had captured more than a decade ago in the waters north of the Narrow Sea. He was tall and lanky, with cunning black eyes and fiery red hair, a bit of an odd duck, but a good Ironborn nonetheless. Here, Heron groused, shoving a glass bottle into Gorman's hand. Looking down at it, Gorman raised an eyebrow, arbor red. You've been having some success then. Lannisport needs more iron than it ever has before. Heron chuckled. They're buying at half again the old rate, all to build some statue or something atop their mountain castle. That and they're giving away books. It's some Greenlander nonsense. Half again. Why I ought to be charging you more then. Gorman feigned outrage as he popped the cork out and poured the sweet red wine into his mouth. He wiped his lips with his sleeve and sighed. Damn, and good vintage too. I thought it was appropriate, Heron said, sitting down on a rock, as unbothered by the cold rain as Gorman was. I have some news as well, might be what got your son. What? Gorman nearly dropped the bottle, nearly. Why didn't you start with that? He stalked over towards Heron, but the other man raised his hand. It didn't really slow Gorman down much, but it let him get the next part out. Calm down, it's not a certain thing. But I did some asking around in Lannisport, knowing Rorik's been gone too long. Heron explained quickly. Turns out that Lord Tywin, that is, Tywin Lannister, sent his brother up to become Lord of the North Coast. They said he'd gone up to stop the raiding and build new towns there. Heron shook his head. They didn't know if he'd caught any Ironborn yet, or anything of that sort. But it's a line to pull on. Gorman stared into his friend's eyes, hard, his brow furrowing in anger, though not at Heron. His brother What's this Lannister's name? Lord Tygett was the name I heard. Heron shrugged. No guarantee he's the one who got Rorik, but it would fit, only do be careful Gorman, the Lannisters are dangerous people. The red-haired man frowned. Lord Tywin butchered 2 houses down to their serving boys and guardsmen just for disrespecting his father. Every mummer and troubadour from Sunspear to Winterfell knows the song they wrote about it. Be careful with your life if you're plotting against his brother. Gorman grit his teeth. That was right, Lord Tywin Lannister was the reigns of Castamer, a Greenlander so powerful and so evil that the king had made him his hand. If Gorman pursued this, and did it badly, it would be a blood feud that his other children might not even survive. The Reaver grimaced, his fingers twitching towards a sword grip he wasn't wearing. What am I to do then? If it was him, I will not let Rorik's blood go unavenged. There are methods to ruin a man without killing him. Heron shrugged. If you defeated him in battle and then only took out his eyes, or gelded him or such, I doubt that Lord Tywin would raise the whole of his fleets against us. Would that satisfy the blood of my son? Gorman asked, not sure of the answer himself. It would be better to kill him, but for no one to know it was me. I might do it with poison, slip into his castle, and put wolfsbane in his dinner. That's a fair idea, but what if you are caught? I doubt most Greenlanders look anything like you. You're not some fair-faced lad anymore. Heron chuckled. Gorman snorted at the insult but nodded. I might be too old for that sort of ploy to work. This is all too much thinking without enough knowledge. Before I make any move, with such great risk especially, I must be sure that it was this Lord Tygett and his men that killed Rorik. Gorman stroked his damp beard. I'll go to Old Wick, and to the other islands, and ask the captains that trade along the Westerlands coast. He decided after a minute. If it was this Lord Tygett, I'll go myself as a trader, learn what I can about his ways, where he dwells, then I will decide on the means of my revenge. Now that sounds like the Gorman I know. Heron grinned. It must be the alcohol, you always make your best plans drunk. Quiet Redbeard. Gorman grumbled, some of us are trying to think. Heron just laughed. Standing up, he wrapped his arm around Gorman's shoulder. Wheel whatever you do, let me know. I liked Rorik, he was a good lad, so I'll help you out with whatever it is you end up planning. What, with your big fat whaler? Gorman asked, chuckling. Nobody would mistake the Leviathan's bane for a warship. Heron smiled at him, his grin going from ear to ear as he looked at Gorman expectantly. You're right, nobody would. Gorman blinked, realization dawning as the words rattled around in his mildly inebriated head, then smirked. I always knew there was a reason I liked you, Heron. His friend chuckled, can't imagine why. Chronicle of the Targaryen dynasty in the Seven Kingdoms. Maester Willem. 279 AC 10th day of first moon. Princess Valia gives birth to a son, Prince Aegon Targaryen, on Dragonstone. The boy is born healthy and his birth cries fill the cavernous halls of the Targaryens' ancestral home. His eyes are heterochromatic, one lavender, one gold, akin to her mother and father. Shortly after the birth of his son, Prince Rhaegar collapses into a fit of fevers, with Princess Valia falling prey to them soon after. There are fears that it is the same disease that has left Queen Rhaella and Lord Steffan Baratheon bedridden these past few months. King Aerys, not suffering from the disease himself, but greatly stressed over the fate of his wife, son, and cousin, declares that all people of King's Landing are to attend daily prayers held by septons in the streets until his family is healed. Lannister. Chapter 85. First Blood I. AN. Next goal for another extra chapter is 150 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Cersei Lannister Pav. It's unfair that Callum isn't here for this. Cersei pouted to herself as she looked at her reflection, distorted by the curvature of the gold leaf on the skin of the great statue. Her mother's face, or perhaps her little brother's, stared back above her reflection, far taller than she was. It's his tribute to mother. Cersei felt emotions boil in her belly as she thought about it. Her sweet soft-hearted brother was off on some nowhere coast with Uncle Tywin, far away, while here in Lannisport he didn't get to see the completion of his great work. It made her sad to think about it. She could imagine the disappointment on his face, and her heart ached for him. Her heart had been aching often as of late. Still, at least she would see him soon enough. She tapped on her elbow as she glanced out towards the grand platform. Already, the metal skeleton of cast iron pillars and beams had been completed, fully erected and towering up so tall that it stood over the whole world. Around it, a massive wooden scaffold had been built up like muscle and flesh around a bone, and a system of pulleys and cranes that were beginning to assemble the outer skin of bronze, covered in gold leaf and lacquer. The assembly of the skin, built in sections and then attached to the outer frame of the skeleton piece by piece, would take another 2 months. Father had announced a tourney to be held when it was completed, a tourney for all the lords of the realm. He would return to Castle Rock, as would Callum and Jaime, and finally, they would all be together again. Unfortunately, that was some months away yet. Cersei would have to struggle on alone. Uncle Kevin had no time to father her, and while Aunt Jenna was a good teacher, a clever woman with a man's soul just like Cersei, she was also restrictive. She had love, yes, but expectations too that went against Cersei's desires. Cersei loved her aunt and all her uncles, but not the way she loved her father and brothers. No, in the dark of the night, no matter how many bedmaids she had to warm her company, Cersei Lannister felt alone. The depth of her love was itself her weakness. Cersei. The voice of Aunt Jenna rang out outside the warehouse, and Cersei felt a slight panic run up her spine at the tone in her aunt's voice. Cersei, are you up here? Cersei paused. She very much did not want to be scolded for being somewhere she wasn't, so she considered hiding in and amongst the pieces of statuary in the warehouse and pretending she wasn't there. Still, on the other hand, Aunt Jenna might actually be looking for her for something important. She weighed both options in her mind, before ultimately deciding she could probably get out of the scolding quickly if she played it off correctly. I'm here, Auntie, in the warehouse, Cersei called back. Aunt Jenna, huffing and puffing and a bit red in the face, no doubt from the climb up the mountain, looked more than a little angry as she stormed into the room like the lioness she was, claws out and teeth bared. Why on earth did you think? She's beautiful, isn't she? Cersei undercut her auntie before she could really lay into her. Positioning herself as if she had been staring at mother's face, which wasn't difficult given that was exactly what she'd been doing. She showed not an ounce of panic on her face. Cersei was a clever girl, and growing more clever by the day. I really wanted to see her. Cersei glanced away from the gilded edifice, seeing as the anger drained out of her aunt just as quickly as she'd stormed in. A success. Aunt Jenna was angry at her for running off without telling her. True, but she would hardly be angry at Cersei for missing her mother. TCH. Her aunt grumbled, walking over much less aggressively now. Foolish girl, why didn't you tell me where you were going? I didn't want to wake you, auntie. I've been here since sunrise, Cersei answered easily. I hadn't planned to stay so long. She let the words hang as she glanced back towards the statue. Without breakfast? Aunt Jenna asked, and Cersei shook her head. That explains why none of the kitchen staff knew where you were. Jenna sighed. I'll have to smooth some ruffled feathers later, no doubt, but still, just tell me when you're going to run off like this. I'd rather be woken a little earlier to know. Cersei put a sad, mostly fake smile on her lips. I'm sorry, auntie, I'll tell you next time. Maybe she even would, it might save a small amount of trouble. Her eyes, though, found their way back to the reflection. I miss them, you know. She asked, not even really thinking the words but feeling them all the same. She reached out, gently brushing her hand on the golden skin. Your mother? Aunt Jenna asked, looking up from beside her. And father, and Jaime and Callum. Cersei nodded. We should all be here, this is where we belong. Cersei frowned. I love you, auntie, and Uncle Kevin too, of course, but it's not the same, you know. I am alone. She sighed. For a long time I could see Callum every day at least, but I fear I babied him too much. When we spoke before he left Iwell, he asked me to treat him more like a brother and less like a child. I think he wants to feel my proper equal, like Jaime. Cersei giggled at the thought Callum could never equal Jaime, because Callum was Callum. He could bottle lightning, or build a statue of Mother the size of a castle tower, and even still he would be as trapped by his circumstances as Cersei was by hers. Of all Mother's children, only Jaime had come out right, and while she was a night older, Jaime was near perfect in a way that Callum was not. I don't think I'll ever be able to see him that way. That was not to say that Callum lacked his own charms but rather that him trying to compete with Jaime would be a fool's errand. She was willing to treat him less like a child, as he'd asked, but he would never be like Jaime. If Jaime and Cersei were brilliant golden suns, then Callum was a beautiful silver moon. Well, perhaps a golden moon, he was still blonde. Cersei stroked her chin as she considered how to phrase her analogy. Well, you are not entirely alone, Aunt Jenna said, patting her shoulder. I know you don't get along with little Tyrion but he is still your brother. Cersei felt her spine stiffen and her hackles raise, her eyes narrowing as she whirled to stare into her aunt's eyes, shaking her head furiously. He is not. Cersei bit out. That imp is not my brother, and he never will be. Her nails bit into her palms as her hands tightened into fists. Cersei, Auntie looked at her tenderly, but Cersei was having none of it. Tyrion was born a kinslayer, and cursed for it by the Seven. He is no brother of mine. Cersei spat, trying to push past her aunt, though Aunt Jenna caught her solidly. Cersei nearly ended up barreling the woman over, for she was taller than Aunt Jenna now. Do not say such things about your brother. Aunt Jenna said sternly. It is tolerable when a child says something foolish, but you are less a child each day. It's best you act like it. Cersei growled, about ready to scream at her aunt when her aunt turned it all right back on Cersei with a single phrase. What would your mother think? Aunt Jenna's tone was not angry, but worse, her scolding tone was soft empathetic. It rang in Cersei's ears and ransacked her brain in a way no angry shout ever could. This is childish Cersei. It was like someone had driven a training sword right into her stomach, the way Cersei felt the breath leave her body. Tears wavered at the edges of her vision. He murdered Mother, she said bitterly, but the anger was already draining out of her. Even if that were true, do you think she would want you to hate him for it? I knew Joanna a long time, and I do not think so. Aunt Jenna said quietly, now hugging Cersei more than stopping her. You have to grow past these feelings someday, Cersei. Your brother will have a hard enough life without you adding to it. Cersei didn't know how to answer that. She couldn't think not properly as she turned around to look up at that great golden face once more. Callum's eyes, Mother's eyes, were they judging her? Was it so wrong to hate the boy that killed her? Cersei let out a whimper and then threw out her arms, breaking Aunt Jenna's hold and rushing from the warehouse. Her thoughts were awhirl as she ran. Down the stairs and further, still, Cersei ran for the tunnels of Castle Rock, ran down into the endless hallways that only she and her brothers knew. Her stomach churned, and her heart thundered as she slumped against the wall, tears streaming down her face. Lannister. Chapter 86. First Blood 2. AN. Next goal for another extra chapter is 300 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Cersei Lannister Pav. Down the stairs and further, still, Cersei ran for the tunnels of Castle Rock, ran down into the endless hallways that only she and her brothers knew. Her stomach churned, and her heart thundered as she slumped against the wall, tears streaming down her face. This was hardly the first time her aunt had told her to be nicer to Tyrion, hardly the first time she'd been scolded so, but somehow this time stung far worse than before. Why? She didn't know why. She felt tears rush down her face. Had it been because of the statue? Had it been because her brothers, her two true brothers, had left her here alone to suffer the company of the imp? Had it been the invocation of her mother, a mother whose face she could barely remember without seeing Callum in her mind? Cersei sobbed and sobbed, shuddering there against the wall. She did not know why she sobbed, why whatever dam she had used to hold back such tears of loneliness and anguish had broken. There in the half-dark of some long-forgotten tunnel in the labyrinthine palace, she, the most clever, courageous, and competent girl in the Seven Kingdoms, sat a crying wreck in the darkness. In dire vulnerability, she sat and sniffled, snot dripping from her perfect nose, her eyes leaking tears as she wished that someone, anyone could be there with her. Mother, father, Jaime, even Callum. She would settle for any of them holding her and speaking comforting words. Her legs quivered as the sobs slowly subsided, the pain in her stomach was. Cersei blinked past the crusted remnants of her tears, snot still dripping beneath her nose, as she investigated her suspicion. Her finger came up with a splatter of red that seemed black in the half-light of the tunnel, the coppery smell confirmed her thoughts. Moon blood, she sniffled. It was her first. Then. Cersei looked at the blood with awe and disgust, then wiped it off on her dress, climbing to her feet as she frowned darkly. It had not been a weakness of the mind that had put her down but a weakness of the body, a woman's body. For a woman, I am now, I suppose, she grumbled to herself, pressing a hand to her belly. Her mind seemed to clear as the fog of doubt departed. She hadn't been wrong, no, not about anything. Aunt Jenna was being too kind to the imp, and Mother would have probably pitched him off the top of the rock or something. Well, maybe she wouldn't go that far, but still, the imp was a kinslayer who deserved his fate. Cersei wiped her face clean best she could with her sleeve and marched towards her chambers. She would wash up, change, and then be on her way. What was the pain of moon blood compared to the blows she had endured in the training yard pretending to be Jaime? She would not be tricked or brought low by such a feeble attack on her senses. No. She was Cersei Lannister, a lioness in her own right. She stalked into her chambers with pride and poise. Seeing Melara changing, she paused only briefly. Leave, Cersei ordered, though the other girl was half undressed. Cersei grinned as she saw the blood start to drain from Melara's face. Good, that ought to bring the greedy girl down a peg. But Cersei, Melara started. Leave, all of you, I don't care where. Jane was there as well, and a few maids. Cersei's green eyes looked over them all like the mice they were, caught before the claws of a Lannister. I've just had my first moon blood. Cersei explained after a moment, and a chorus of ohs and sounds of acknowledgement followed from the other girls and women. Would you like any? One of the maids, Cersei didn't remember which one, started, and Cersei shook her head. Out. All of you. I want to be alone. Cersei roared, and that got them moving. Even half-dressed Melara knew not to get in Cersei's way. They scattered like rats, and soon Cersei was alone in her chambers. As she went to wash her face in the basin, shedding the outer layer of her dress, Cersei frowned at how she looked in the mirror. Had she always been so gangly? So thin? She frowned as the cool water ran down her face, wiping back the residue of her earlier tears with a handkerchief, before casting it aside. Her frown was ugly, and she needed to do something else. Her eyes settled on the fireplace. Walking over, she picked up a poker, heavy and cast iron. It felt good in her hand. It was no sword, not the weapon she wanted to wield, but it was close enough. Close enough for Cersei as she set about releasing her anger on her furniture, pillows, everything in reach really. Anything to make this feeling of weakness go away. Tywin Lannister Pav. Winter had come to Westeros, brutally and with little warning. The White Ravens of the Citadel had arrived on the north coast only 2 days ahead of a brutal storm off of Ironman's Bay. Tranquil autumn had turned to blistering, freezing rain and slush, that froze overnight on the ground, trapping the land in a shell of bitter ice. The hilly ground of the north coast became impossible to traverse under its wrath, even as they mostly avoided the deep snows that buried the more northerly regions of Westeros. Instead, the warm rain rushing in from the sunset sea met the pale wall of darkness issuing from the north beyond the wall and froze, often plunging down like icy daggers that cut to the bone. While a few hardier crops, largely sprouts, carrots, spinach, and turnips could still be grown in Tyget's domain, staving off the fear of starvation, the horrible weather still claimed a few lives over the course of every winter. Worse, the frosty ground made it almost impossible to respond to the raids of the Ironborn. No horse could cross overland in such conditions, but the rivers only rarely froze, and even then not thickly, letting the Ironborn sail inland and plunder farmsteads and villages, isolated and defenseless. It was yet another reason that the region was so often subject to Ironborn attack. It is a bitter land. Tyget grumbled as he leaned over the table, looking down at the map before him. I know it better every day. The arrival of winter, unexpected as it had been, wrought havoc on the Lord Temper's plans. He had grown his forces large enough, recruited enough mounted militiamen, and trained them, to break his forces up properly over the north coast, creating, essentially multiple outposts of cavalry who could quickly respond to Ironborn attacks. There was one in Eagle's Nest, where he had been until Third Moon, which was led by Esser Clymouth, and another at Readinghall led by Esser Ludo. Tyget had moved his own staff back to Anlin's Hill on the Black River since it was towards the center of his lands. Controlling 3 of the 5 major rivers would make raiding unprofitable, and let Tygett weed out whatever fools still tried to ruin his lands more effectively. It would be a longer-term strategy, but it would cull the Ironborn eventually. Callum had also suggested building a series of fortified homes in the more prominent villages in the region to act as sort of false keeps, saving the inhabitants from the Ironborn until reinforcements could arrive. It wasn't a terrible idea, and Tygett had started seriously looking into it around mid-year, figuring the process of moving stone from outlying fields into village centers and quickly erecting the bastard castles. Only one had actually been finished, in the village of Meridian on the Gold Gap. He had plans to build more of them in all the river villages. Now all of those plans had burned away like smoke with the arrival of winter. Winter construction was possible, certainly, but transportation was difficult, and he could hardly travel across the land building them with things as they were. Instead, he sat in the old parlor in the stone keep, resting on an uncomfortable chair and a velvet cushion by the fire while his people were subject to raiding and slaughter beyond any ability to respond. Are you all right? Tygett glanced up from his nap. His nephew, now 11, was sprawled out on a sofa across the parlor with his head propped up on several pillows, a book in his hands. His blonde hair was growing long again, but his face had gained a small semblance of manliness over the last year. Though, it was probably just more gaunt. Callum had gotten a lot thinner since coming under Tygett's care, a testament to the exercise he put him through, and to the admittedly dull foodstuffs available on the coast, especially compared to Castle Rock. Lannister. Chapter 87. Winter comes like a hammer. AN. Next goal for another extra chapter is 400 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Tygett Lannister Pav. Callum had gotten a lot thinner since coming under Tygett's care, a testament to the exercise he put him through, and to the admittedly dull foodstuffs available on the coast, especially compared to Castle Rock. That was not to say the boy had gotten weaker though, indeed, Callum had become a wiry, muscular lad. When Tygett had first taken on his nephew, he'd assumed the boy was a sloth with no fire in his gut, but Callum had thrown himself into his training with a dedication that has proved Tygett wrong. He certainly was no match for his brother, and he lacked the fiery ambition of a true warrior, but he was no longer unsuited to be a squire. In reward for his efforts, Tygett had allowed him a greater level of freedom. He had even intended to bring him out to fight the Ironborn, though Winter's arrival had ended that plan like so many others. You're wearing an odd expression, Uncle Tygett. I'm healthy enough, only frustrated, Tygett said. He had grown much more comfortable around the boy over the last year. Honestly, he was probably closer to Callum than he was to Tywin or Kevin at this point. When your father made me lord of this land, I did not realize just how bitter a gift it would be. Well, if it is too bitter, you'll only be lord of it for another 9 moons, Callum replied, not looking away from his book. That's when your term as Lord Temper expires, or at least it would be. I doubt that father will recall you in winter. Tygett chuckled dryly. Typically, he would never accept the level of cheek and familiarity that Callum had from a squire, but as his nephew, the boy had a fair bit more room afforded to him. I didn't say it was unsuitable, boy. Bitter lands need bitter men to lead them. That's why the northern lords are all so dour. Tygett imagined that their lands were much like his own, only poorer and somehow even worse off, facing the constant threat of starvation in winter. Besides, despite the raids, Tywin still receives more in tax than the paltry sum he collected before. I doubt he'll refuse me at all if I ask to continue. Indeed, Callum said, shutting his book and sitting up a bit to match Tygett's gaze. You know, when I wrote my political treatise, I insisted that Lord's Temper should be moved around every 5 years. Callum paused for a moment. But in the current situation, moving you off of the north coast would be disastrous. I don't think father will do it. Not based on my correspondence with him. Oh. Tygett had to admit, he wrote to Tywin far less than his nephew did. If he was going to take orders from Tywin, then he'd get them through Kevin if he could. Kevin might be their eldest brother's lapdog, but at least he could phrase an order in a way that didn't leave Tygett fuming. And what's on Tywin's mind? Callum paused a moment, scratching his chin, which still hadn't grown a single hair so far as Tygett could tell. I think he prefers stability in the Westerlands above all else right now. The boy said quietly. With the statue left unfinished due to the winter, the tourney for it called off, of course, and I think father's actually relieved about that, as much as he wants to see it done. Tygett had heard that story from a crestfallen Callum. Workmen simply could not safely assemble the top part of the skin in the harsh winter winds atop Castley Rock. Joanna's giant golden edifice stood half-assembled only up to about her hips, overlooking Lannisport. She would stay that way until the weather improved. Things are, well, I don't know what you've heard, but King's Landing is dangerous right now, even for father. Tygett frowned. He hadn't heard anything of the sort from Kevin. I suppose it has to do with the Queen's condition. Callum nodded. Queen Rhaella seemed to get better around midyear, but the winter has apparently sent her right back into her illness, and Maester Pycelle says it's worse than before. In his estimate, she'll likely die before the new year. Tygett hissed. That's disheartening. He knew there was enmity between House Lannister and the king, or rather between Tywin and the king, but no one had ever spoken ill of Queen Rhaella. And nobody knows what King Aerys will do when she does, especially with Rhaegar and Princess Valia still suffering from the same ailment. At least Lord Stefan has recovered. Callum continued. Father is working with him to prepare in advance in case, the boy paused. Well, in case King Aerys does something foolish when she does. He has already become very paranoid over her illness. Tygett felt his eyebrows lift. Is there a risk of war? Why had he not been told of something so important? Surely Kevin knew. A very low risk, I think. Aerys does at least trust Lord Stefan for the moment, and no sane man wants a civil war just because the Queen got sick. Callum said, but a low risk isn't no risk at all, and father is taking precautions just in case. Tell him not to murder the whole royal family. He suggested nothing of the sort, only forcing Aerys to abdicate in favor of Rhaegar or Viserys if the king goes too far. Callum frowned. Do you mind if I change the subject? I always find myself worrying too much when I think about father and King's Landing. I don't, Tygett started to reply, only for Qyburn to storm into the room, his black cloak bearing a thin coating of sleet on his shoulders and atop his hood. The Black Maester looked harried. My lords, the normally grouchy healer said. A messenger just arrived from the west. Qyburn looked slightly out of breath. He says that the Ironborn are burning the running country and that they razed Mallow's stone to the ground. What? Tygett blinked, glancing down at his map. But that's a fishing port. The Ironborn never raid fishing ports. They did too much trade there. It was much better for them to go inland a ways, or to raid isolated homesteads, than to raid the villages where an Ironborn fisherman or trader could make good money selling their likely stolen loot. This isn't a typical raid, my lord. Qyburn wiped off his shoulders, growing visibly less panicked as he spoke. The messenger said it was a fleet of 6 longships, 3 of them larger than the raiders we normally see. I'd call that more of a war party. The Black Maester paused a moment. Sir Ludo is apparently awaiting your order at Reddinghall. He was unsure if he should sally out given he might be outnumbered. Smart man. Tygett nodded. This sort of thing wasn't a raid he could just let pass, this was more like an invasion fleet. Even with all the constraints of winter, he needed to launch a counterattack. Send a raven to Reddinghall at once, tell him to wait until I arrive to reinforce his position, and send another to Plymouth in Eagle's Nest, tell him to be on guard in case this is part of a larger invasion. Yes, my lord. Qyburn nodded, before turning to Callum as if the boy would have anything more to add. Callum only shook his head. Go on, Qyburn. The man nodded, and hurried out, reminding Tygett that the healer was more Callum's creature than his, just like that man Lyman, Septon Loban, and a few other men in the cavalry. It was disconcerting to see them listen to a boy so young, but it was not something Tygett felt a need to correct. He turned to his nephew and frowned. You will accompany me as my squire when we depart tomorrow morning. On horseback? Callum asked, frowning right back. If this ice storm persists. On foot with wagons maybe, for the men and their gear. If we rode out in this weather the horses would all be lame before we reached the Ironborn. We'll be wise to bring food supplies with us too. It's not impossible we get stuck in Geert's Gap if this turns into a blizzard over the next few days. We won't be taking Geert's Gap. We'll follow the coast. Tygett said, glancing at his map. The Ironborn have a better chance of spotting us coming, but it will be warmer if we avoid the high passes and I'd rather have fewer deaths before we even reach the fight. Right. Callum nodded. In that case, I should go prepare your armor. Yes. Tygett nodded. And yours as well. Chronicle of the Targaryen dynasty in the Seven Kingdoms. Maester Willem. 279 AC 12th day of 9th moon. The early arrival of winter 2 weeks ago wreaks havoc across the Seven Kingdoms, particularly the north. Queen Rhaella also begins to suffer once again from the sickness that has plagued her since last year, with her symptoms worsening with the winter chill. News from Dragonstone says that the same is at least not true for Princess Valia or Prince Rhaegar and that they are continuing to recover. Lady Cassandra Baratheon, née Estermont, wife of Lord Stefan Baratheon, gives birth to a baby girl, who is named Argilla, though Lord Stefan remains in King's Landing during her birth. Lannister. Chapter 88. Graying Men with Bloody Axes. AN. Next goal for another extra chapter is 500 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Gorman Bloodtooth Pav. A thick pillar of smoke curled up from what had once been a Westerlands village. Dark and fat, it curled up into the sky like one of the Targaryens' old dragons, and like them, it brought fiery ruin to the Greenlanders. The sight of it made Gorman smile. Reaving like this reminded him of better days. Through the thick of the near-freezing rain on the bay, Gorman had come to the town of Lower Bannock in the early morning twilight. 3 ships and nearly 250 Ironborn had fallen upon the sleepy fishing with axes, spears, and swords, and slaughtered any Greenlander stupid enough to fight back. This was no casual raid by boys pretending to be men. No, this was a proper reaving fleet of the type that normally set off for the Stepstones or Essos. The men were veterans of many battles, their gear was polished and painted, and their hearts hardened by the weight of years. Well, Gorman chuckled, glancing to his right. That's not to say that there's no young men with us. The truth of the matter was that Gorman never would have been able to muster a raiding fleet this great without outside backing. Oh, he had a reputation as an excellent reaver, many friends, and a good 2 ships to his name already. It had been 3 before Rorik had lost Skolda to the Lannisters. But when he had gone out to gather allies, he had only been able to secure the help of his good friend Harren and 1 ship from his wife's father, and Rorik's grandfather, Lord Sunderly. A fleet of 4 ships with only 2 proper warships would only have been half the force he had now. No, it had been while he was still acting as a trader, gathering information on the lands under this Lord Tywin Lannister, that he had been approached by the younger man. Dark of eye and dark of hair, he had introduced himself as Longshanks, but Gorman had sussed out who he was before the conversation was over. Lord Quellen's heir, Balon Greyjoy, was not a subtle man. He had come to make an offer, for he had heard about Gorman's vendetta, and Longshanks approved of it. Everyone knew that Balon openly disagreed with his father's prohibitions on raiding in Westeros, and the young man saw the opportunity to make a show of this raid and further weaken his father Quellen's position against raiding. So, Longshanks had accompanied Gorman, and doubled his fleet in the process, and the plan to draw out Lord Tiggett's Greenlander horsemen had transformed into a plot to pillage and burn the settlements of the north coast, and remind both Ironmen and Greenlanders just why the Ironborn were to be feared. They painted their hulls black and raised grey sails with no sigil, removed what identifying marks they could, and set out from the harbor at Oldwick with the blessing of the drowned god, to go forth and reave and take what they will from lesser men. Only the arrival of winter had slowed them down a bit, but even that didn't hold them back. If the Ironborn didn't know how to fish in the bay during winter, then they would starve like the Skago Sea. It wasn't like going out onto the Sunset Sea with its winter waves that could swallow a Leviathan whole. The bay was sheltered from the worst of the storm god's wrath, and while the cold could be blistering and the rain could cut you to the bone, it was both traversable and fishable in all the winters Gorman had ever seen. With men that knew the bay like the back of their hand, it had taken only 15 days for most of the fleet to arrive at Mallin's Stone, near the edge of Mallister lands, and burn it to the ground. What's caught your eyes, Bloodtooth? Longshanks asked from beside him. You've been staring into the woods for a minute, did you spot a deer? The slightly mocking tone from the Greyjoy heir was hardly unexpected, but it also wasn't anything Gorman could do anything about. At the end of it, he needed the other man much more than Longshanks needed him. No, I'm only thinking on our next move. Gorman lied easily. The running river is largely undefended, so the traders say. There are villages enough along its banks, to plunder and burn, and draw out our foes. Gorman tapped his chin. Despite all the benefits, he didn't think it would be the right choice. I think it would be the wrong move though. On the shores of the bay, the advantage is all on our side, but if we were trapped on a river, supposedly that was how Lord Tygett had caught Rorik, they'd trapped Skolda and her crew on a river fort and then cut all the Ironborn down like dogs in the shallows. Gorman could see this was an enemy who had put thought into how to counter their raiding tactics. Well, you're too late for that then. Longshanks replied, biting down on a piece of mutton that they'd cooked on the fire. Heralfi and Lonard are already heading inland by that route. They told me when we left Mallin's Stone. What? Gorman whirled and snapped. Why in the drowned god's halls didn't you tell me? He stared at the younger man in disbelief, but the Greyjoy only shrugged. It wouldn't have made a difference. In the end, they're captains, and their ships are their own. You can hardly blame them and their men for wanting a few more salt wives. This isn't the time to go off on independent raids, Gorman growled. We need to have enough men to crush Tywin Lannister when he comes out to fight. He's got what, 500 at most, hasn't he? Longshanks chuckled. 500 Greenlanders at that, and without horses. They're no threat, not in this weather. As long as our 3 proper warships stay together, we could face his whole horde directly and win. Then you can take your iron price. Longshanks' grin was cruel. There's no need to rush things, let the captains have their fun. Gorman could only glare at this little half-weaned rookie. That same sort of mindset was probably what had gotten Rorik killed. Longshanks' Balin, that is, had probably never faced death in the eye before. It was the only explanation of why he could be so flippant about something so heavy. Gorman snatched a leg of mutton from the fire and stood up. Right, tell your crew we'll be moving tomorrow, the rest day is cancelled. Longshanks frowned. Why? There's no rush. There is now. Gorman threw him a glare. If Lord Lannister catches wind that there's a few smaller ships operating unhindered in the running country, I'd bet he'll call up his garrison and go out to trap them on the river, just like he did to Rorik. Gorman grinned a bit. I don't particularly care if he does or doesn't. If those two gave it any thought, they wouldn't have run off on their own. Of course, he could also let them run rampant and come chasing us instead. Either way, it benefits us, as his attention will be split regardless. We need to ride that wind while it lasts. Gorman bit down hard into the mutton he'd picked up and tore off a section of the meat, swallowing it down with an aggressive bite, hardly chewing. He reached out his arm and pointed it toward the ocean. Down the coast a ways there is Trout Point, which we can probably raid tomorrow at sunset if we start sailing at dawn, then on down the coast. The Greenlanders won't know what to do. I don't know about your old war dog's Bloodtooth, but my men need time to rest. Longshanks cautioned, glancing over at his warship. Or rather, the warship that Longshanks had borrowed from his friends in House Drum. He couldn't exactly go out sailing around in a House Greyjoy vessel in full defiance of his father. I've had successful raids before, but many of the men just took their first salt wives, give them some time to enjoy it. Gorman scoffed. He'd been young once too, but it was the job of the old men to tell the young to stop thinking with their cocks. Tell them they can have all the time they want once I've plucked Tywin Lannister's eyes from their sockets and sent him scampering back to Castle Rock. Longshanks frowned, the Greyjoy heir not happy to be ordered about, but after a moment he nodded. Good, he still hadn't let whatever past success he'd had to get ahead of the fact that Gorman had been captaining raids longer than he'd been alive. I'll get them moving, but there'll be grumbling about this. Longshanks started moving. You'd better keep winning, Gorman. That's how it always is. Gorman chuckled. In a raiding fleet like this, every captain was really out for himself. There was no loyalty except to the man who could lead them to better loot and plunder. If it started looking like Gorman was going to lose in this little blood feud against Lord Lannister, then his fleet would melt away like winter snow under summer sunlight. Gorman turned to his own ships and started walking, their black hulls little more than silhouettes painted against the shore. His crew were mostly gathered out on the beach, counting out the thralls and women and loot, or sitting about and gambling around small campfires. Gorman pounded his breastplate, making a loud ruckus as he stepped up on top of a tree stump, his armored form cast in the firelight as he got the attention of his crew. Men! Gorman shouted, his voice tearing over the din of quiet nighttime conversations. We've had victory and plunder today, but we are not done. Gorman looked back and forth over the assembled listeners, the armored Ironborn raiders, the quivering thralls, and sobbing new salt wives. No, the lord of these Greenlanders, Tywin Lannister, who took the lives of my son Rorik and his crew, will no doubt hear of our successes soon. He will march up the coast with his Greenlander pussies in their shining armor, and seek to trap and butcher us, but it'll be him who suffers. His men will die, and I'll send him back cowering to his brother in Lannisport without any eyes left in his head for what he did to my boy. Gorman spat. But to make that happen, we have to strike hard and fast. I'm sure you all know that, you've all seen me do it before. He grinned, and that means we won't be having that day of rest we planned on, not yet anyway. There were a few grumbles from the crowd at that. But Gorman wasn't worried at all. These were his men, and while there was no loyalty between captains, there was plenty of it from his crew. Men with graying beards and long years of raiding would be annoyed, but not truly dismayed at the prospect of moving quickly. We sail at dawn. Gorman finished, looking out over the crowd once again. So get all our takings stored below deck, and get some shut-eye if you're smart. We've got blood and plunder ahead of us once again. Chronicle of the Targaryen dynasty in the Seven Kingdoms. Maester Willem. 279 AC 18th day of 9th moon. The realm mourns the death of Queen Rhaella Targaryen, who passed away last night as confirmed by Grand Maester Pycelle after suffering from a strange illness for over a year. Even Archmaester Ebrose, widely acclaimed as the greatest healer of the Citadel and called up half a year ago, was unable to determine the cause of the sickness and was only able to ease the symptoms and pain somewhat in the Queen's dying days. King Aerys has barred all men from visiting his quarters, where he mourns in private, while Prince Rhaegar and his family rush to return from Dragonstone. A funeral has been arranged at the Great Sept of Baelor. May the stranger guide our Queen's soul to the Mother's heaven safely. Lannister. Chapter 89. The Cold Way to Readinghall. AN. Next goal for another extra chapter is 600 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Lyman Pav. Lyman shuddered as the wind off of Ironman's Bay cut through the wagon. Cold and damp, while it wasn't quite freezing, the bitter gale still made him shudder, even kept mostly warm by his thick wool coat. The winter march was near enough to the hells as they went easy overland, a column of a little more than 200 men spread across 24 wagons tugged by mules and horses. There was no good route in this kind of weather. Soft dirt and grasslands became muddy morasses in the chilly downpour, while rocky uplands were often coated in sleet, rendering them treacherous and unnavigable. The wagons, of course, hated both with an equal passion, and often more than once a day one of their number would lose a wheel or some other key component, but that needed to be replaced. All while the winds bit at their skin and the damned Ironborn raped the coastline with their wanton fleet of robbers. It was utter misery for the men involved, but Lord Tygott kept them moving. Up and down the column he would ride, albeit not always on the same horse. He would check in on every group of men, seemingly undaunted by the sleet through which he rode. Do you need anything? He would ask, and each time they would all say no, and he would nod, but he would look them over, and if a man looked sickened or freezing, he would come back a minute later with blankets, or hot stew that was always kept warm on the lead cart in a small pot. Lyman thought it was probably dangerous to keep a fire going all the time on a wooden cart on slushy ground, but he'd take the black before he ever admitted that with a bowl of warm stew in his hands. In the evenings, when the sun set over the western horizon, they would find rocky, broken ground and pressed their tents close together in circles to act as windbreaks. They'd build lean-tos out of wood pulled from the forests on the coast, allowing campfires to stay lit despite the sleet. It was a harsh and bitter march, though it only dropped below freezing occasionally. The truth of the matter was that nearly everything ended up soaking and cold, and if their gear hadn't been good sheep's wool they all would have fallen ill from the chill. Damn the Ironborn, Egbert, one of the other men in Lyman's group grumbled. Damn them for making us fight in this weather. The man scooted a little closer to the fire, almost on the edge of the fire pit, sticking his hands in his armpits to keep them warm. We could have been safe in the keep, all holed up for winter. Lyman nodded, roasting a bit of beef on a skewer over the fire as it sizzled and spattered when occasional bits of sleet managed to make it past the edges of their shelter. This weather favors ducks, not men, he grumbled, but at least the Ironborn can't make much headway in it either. They won't be able to unfurl the sails on their longships in this sort of sleet. Lyman sighed, it might actually work out better for us in the long term. That's provided we don't all slip and fall and die in a ditch before we even get to fight them, Egbert commented. This is miserable. I tend to agree. Lyman blinked as another voice joined the group. Looking out the side of the shelter, he saw that young Lord Callum had joined them under their lean-to. Looking a bit miserable and soaked to the bone, his young voice stood out like a sore thumb amongst the grumbling soldiers. Still, it's necessary, we can't simply let the Ironborn burn the whole coast just because the weather is bad for marching or riding. The slender boy coughed a couple more times, shaking his head. Are you all right, my lord? Lyman asked with concern, but Callum just waved him off. It's only a small cold, and we've got Qyburn with us. I doubt it'll hamper me for long. The blonde squire gave him a small smile. That man is the best or second best healer in Westeros, and I trust him more than anything with my health, much as I wouldn't trust him with hardly anything else. Callum laughed a bit, then coughed again. Lyman shared a glance with Egbert, and they both nodded. This wasn't something to take casually. Callum wasn't just any squire, he was Lord Tywin's son, and Lyman was loyal to him besides. Does Lord Tygott know? Not yet, I'll tell him in a bit, Callum answered. You should tell him now, Lyman said, standing up and pulling his cloak over his shoulders. Come on. I'm fine. Callum stared at him defiantly for a moment, before he suddenly coughed again. You're young and small still, my lord. Lyman said, no need to put on a brave face for us. You'll be little use sick if we have to fight the Ironborn. I said I'm fine, Callum said, frowning before he sighed. All right, we can go tell my uncle. Very good, my lord. Lyman decided it probably wouldn't be within his rights to pat the boy on the shoulder, so he tried to give that impression with his voice, before he walked over towards the command tent, standing in colors of red and gold, separate and up the slope away from the rest of the men huddling around their fires in the cold air. It was fairly imposing, but Lyman was determined to make sure that Lord Tygett knew of his nephew's condition. He glanced down at Callum, who seemed resigned to his fate. I'm coming in, uncle, Callum said, gesturing that Lyman could follow him in, out of the cold rain, which was a blessing. Lord Tygett's tent was barer than Lyman would have imagined, but on second thought it did fit his character, and the furniture and equipment inside were all clearly of the highest standard, despite there being not much more than a bed, a few chests, and a fireplace and cookpot sitting in the center. Lord Tygett looked to have been studying a map on the tent's only table. The grizzled Lannister looked up at them as they entered. Callum, what is it? I've caught a small cold, uncle, Callum answered. It's really nothing too dangerous, but Lyman insisted I tell. The boy fell into a fit of coughs, and Lyman saw Lord Tygett's expression change. The taciturn man stared at his nephew for a long moment as Callum tried to catch his breath, then slowly nodded. Right, he said grimly. Have you spoken to Qyburn about it? Not yet. Callum shook his head. It's really not a big deal, uncle. I'm sure I'll be better by the time we reach Reddinghall. Lord Tygett shook his head. Be that as it may. He said slowly. This weather is worse than I feared, for you, the wagons, and the men. I will take no chances. Once we reach Reddinghall we will hold until these storms break and we are safe to ride once more. If we fought the Ironborn as we are now, we would simply die. Yes, uncle. May I go speak to Qyburn now? Yes. And Callum. Tygett paused. Do not hide such things from me in the future. I need all information to make good decisions. Yes, uncle. Callum nodded, heading for the door quickly. Lyman, realizing that he was only here for Callum's safety, followed after him quickly, though Callum soon enough asked to speak to Qyburn alone, and Lyman had to return to his tent. Soon enough, between the biting wind, the soaking rain, and the cramped space of his tent, Lyman stopped worrying about Callum. This was a mistake despite what were apparently Qyburn's best efforts. Young Lord Callum's conditions only worsened over the next pair of days. He was hardly the only one to fall sick on their march to Reddinghall, and when, after days of miserable travel, they finally arrived at the small castle, they soon overcrowded its walls. Through it all though, Lyman had to admit that he had developed something of a grudging respect for Qyburn. The Black Maester was a grudging healer at times, but faced with so many patients the man proved surprisingly able. Throughout the barracks of the keep, Qyburn stalked like a thundercloud. By some mystical sight Lyman didn't understand the man could sort the sick from the healthy at a mere glance, and shuffle them all off into a separate hall, where they would not carry their illness to any of the other men. How Qyburn avoided being himself sickened Lyman could only guess at, but no one in the fortress could deny his aptitude as he treated so many with little to no help. At last, Lyman could see why Lord Callum put such faith in the man. Callum himself though was another matter. Lyman had only gotten to see him a few times, ensconced as he was in Lord Tygett's chambers, resting by the fire, and doing little more than read, write, and sleep. He looked sickly, and had even lost his ability to speak above a whisper. He was clearly suffering through it and seemed more angry to be sick than anything. That anger was redoubled when, on the third day after arriving at Reddinghall, the sleet storms finally broke, and the sky turned blue with fluffy white clouds, warm enough to need little more than a jacket. Lyman was glad for it. While he had made it through healthy enough, he was long tired of dreary skies, bitter winds and rain. Callum was less pleased, still unable to speak much and coughing his lungs out. Though despite that he'd still sent well over 24 letters in those 2 days. Unfortunately for the boy, no amount of paper or ink would see Lord Tygett let Callum ride out to fight the Ironborn in his current condition. Lannister. Chapter 90. Culling the Running River. AN. Next goal for another extra chapter is 750 power stones. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Tygett Lannister Pav. Tygot's plate sat heavily on his shoulders as he lifted his visor, eyes scanning the distant flow of the running river, some 3 miles down the sloping highlands from where he was standing. This part of the northern coast was a rocky turf of bracken, peat bogs, and thistles. What few settlements made their way in this harsh region were hardscrabble sorts, rough small-time miners and prospectors, shepherds, and cattle herders. It was little wonder that the Ironborn had fallen upon this region so greedily. Livestock and precious metals were the main products, and both were easy to transport and valuable, at least compared to other goods. But the Ironborn, driven by their wanton lusts and greed, were also stupid. Down below on the open ground, a great lot of them had beached one of their ships, a classic Ironborn vessel. It had the rough appearance of one of their fishing boats, but this longship was slightly too narrow and slightly too long, with more ports for oars than any fisher had crew. Oh, no doubt some fishing was done from the vessel below him, but if you knew the Ironborn, and studied their methods, you could spot it as a raider from 2 miles away. Coincidentally, that was just what Tygot was doing. It was early evening, and the men down below were blatantly at rest. They had a number of roaring bonfires going, and from the distant shapes of men below, he would bet that they were already half drunk on the pilfered wines of the Westerlands. His lance. Tygot turned to look behind him. Altogether he had managed to assemble about 150 men and the horses to carry them. It left a garrison of a good 40 men at Readinghall but emptied the stables dry. Near every trained riding horse west of Anlin's Hill was on the field behind him, and many of his best men. Looking across his gathered force, their lances ready at attention, the Lannister coat of arms blazoned on their shields, Tygot smiled. They may not be proper knights, most of them, but these men were good enough on the charge to shatter those Ironborn cowards. He'd prove that and more today. I will not waste words on insults or idle chatter, Tygot said darkly. Kill them all, free the captives, and end one more threat to our land. Tygot raised his lance, bringing his horse to turn around towards the enemy, and shouting. On my lance, charge. Tygot brought his horse to a low gallop. She could have gone faster, even despite the armor, but he needed the rest of the horses to keep up, and most weren't proper warhorses like his. Still, as they came up over the ridge they had been watching from, they poured down the highland turf like thunder. If the Ironborn spotted them immediately, riding in a giant chevron, they might have at most 4 minutes to respond before the charging Westerlanders had crashed into their camp. Perhaps enough time to find weapons and form a shield wall, but not enough to put on armor, or, crucially, to get their longship moving once again. That was what Tygot counted on, staring down at the damnable raiders as the wind on the heights set his pennon thrashing on his lance. He grit his teeth and felt the battle fury wash over him as time slowed down ahead of him. Each passing second seemed to take hours as he narrowed the gap with his quarry, the Ironborn reacting in disarray, trying desperately to set a shield wall ahead of their impending deaths. Tygot sighted one man, bellowing orders from the right side of the shield wall, and at once the Lannister knew that was the man he was going to kill. His lance lowered, and he slammed his visor down over his face, but his eyes never left that man's head. He spurred his horse onward and roared from his lungs as he made his strike. Like a stone thrown from a catapult, he smashed into the line, his lance piercing straight into the head of the Ironborn leader. Blood splattered as the tip crushed through the raider's spine and the sharpened point pushed out the back of his neck. His cheeks and jawbones tore and shattered as the top of his head, helmet, and all was ripped off of his body by the force of Tygot's strike, and that was before his horse hit the lines. Her armored bulk crushed through 2 more men, staring gaping at the corpse of their leader, and knocked them to the ground, where they were promptly trampled as the men behind him made contact with the rest of the line. It was a massacre. The Ironborn, unarmored and barely called to line out of their revelry, were lanced through with the gleaming spears of the Westerlanders, their bodies knocked aside and then trampled under the hooves of the horses as the charge hit home with all the force of the warrior's sword. Where some 50 ragged men had stood against them, not one was left standing in the wake of their first pass. Most were dead, or dying, and what few still had a chance at life lay bleeding, wounded, trampled, and smashed by the weight of their horses. Tygot turned his horse before he reached Riverside, turned, and raised his lance high so that the men could see his lion pennon high so that the men could see him. He raised his visor and shouted over the din. Half of you, dismount and seize the ship. The other half kill the rest of these rabble. We'll take no prisoners today. His men cheered in approval as he nodded towards them. It didn't take too long for things to resolve after that. A few of the Ironborn were still on their ship, but they were in no condition to fight and certainly not against such numbers of boarders. Most had been asleep, or having their way with their captives. They were all dead now, hauled off the ship and stripped naked to be burned with the rest of the corpses. There would be no drowned god waiting for these squids when they were cast down to the seven hells. Tygett took some satisfaction in that. Once the initial tasks had been taken care of, and the dead were smoldering some half-mile away, Tygett set about the task of questioning the captives. While he took care not to make them uncomfortable, given what they'd been through, the information they had on the movements of the Ironborn fleet was critical to stopping the raiders for good. 12 young women and 6 men were ultimately found on the fishing boat. While most of them had been kidnapped recently, many of them had managed to hear conversations amongst the Ironborn during their captivity, and from their combined testimony, Tygett was able to build out a clearer picture of just what sort of force they were facing. The Ironborn had come at the call of one Gorman Bloodtooth, an apparently notorious raider whose son Tygett had killed during one of the previous raids he'd stopped. That much was obvious from what the captives were able to share. The man had a fleet of at least 6 ships with him, though 2 of that number had spun off to raid the running country, while the others held to the coast. That was the important part. He had one more group of Ironborn to butcher before the running river was safe, and then it seemed the rest of his foes were on the coast. Once he's learned what he could, he had a group of his men, some 6 riders, break off to ensure that whatever stolen loot had been recovered, along with the captives he had freed, be sent back to the villages and hamlets that still lived in these lands, and then he set off with the rest of his forces, a group of them taking the longship as he rowed up the river with all the rest of his men. It was 2 days of travel before they found their prey. There at the confluence of the running river, where all of its many twists and branches turned northwest and joined to flow out to the sea. It was there that they caught the bastards sailing out of the northern branch, their ship fat and loathsome. The one he had captured sailed about and rammed her, forcing the Ironborn onto the shore. The fighting was much bloodier than the first battle had been. The Ironborn were not drunk, and they had their armor on. Moreover, they fought on their ship instead of on the open ground where the cavalry could butcher them. By the time the whole of the crew had been slain and the ship seized, 10 of Tygett's men were dead, and another dozen injured. It was nowhere near as clean as their earlier victory, but a victory it was nonetheless. As before, the captives were freed, and as before, the loot was sent out to go and be distributed across the running country so that the people might rebuild from the raiding and be able to survive the harsh winter. He spent another day and a half on the running river. Hasty repairs were made on the 2 small longships he'd been able to capture. He was also able to replenish his own forces somewhat, as men returned from the field and brought with them more riders and horsemen, as well as volunteers from Malin Stone and other fishing settlements that had burned. Those men he set to work crewing the new ships. His losses were managed and he retained his strength for the ride back west, just in time as it happened. A letter arrived by courier midday on this 4th day of campaigning in the running country. Trout Point had been burned to the ground, and the Ironborn main fleet was moving west. They had taken the opportunity with Tygett tied up in the running country to assail the coastline of his heartland, approaching even the Gold Gap. Tygett had to leave his new volunteer footmen behind and ride west with all the speed he could muster. He would arrive too late for many of his subjects. Chronicle of the Targaryen dynasty in the Seven Kingdoms. Maester Willem. 279 AC 22nd day of 9th moon. Queen Rhaella's funeral is held at the Great Sept of Baelor. King Aerys arrives at the funeral in mourner's robes, looking wearied but strong as his son Rhaegar and Princess Valia accompany him to the casket. The king weeps openly into Princess Valia's arms and tears at his hair as he sees the casket opened. King Aerys retreats once again to his quarters and declares an end to all sessions of the small council for a 2-month period in mourning. The king refuses to hold court, and the king's hand Lord Tywin Lannister is forced to hold it in his stead, despite the lack of support from the small council given the halt to sessions. May the stranger guide our queen's soul to the mother's heaven safely. If you'd like to support my work, or get early access to chapters before public release, you can join my Patreon. Link to join my Patreon. Patreon.com/Moonlight10